Since he was little, Kim Jian had grown up on this very land. He lived in a temple, side by side with a kind and gentle old monk, and with the young girl Kim Jaina, who was like real family to him. The bond between the three of them was always warm, close, and unshakable. But today, the very moment the main character returned, the first thing waiting for him was the sight of the monk lying face down on the ground, completely motionless. Beside him stood a man in a tattered red cloak, his back turned toward the boy. The moment he heard movement behind him, that man slowly turned his head around, and when Kim Jaina and the young man saw the scene before their eyes, they were both struck speechless, frozen by overwhelming shock. In a single instant, it felt as if everything had collapsed. The man in red immediately got to his feet and awkwardly claimed that what happened to the monk had nothing to do with him. He even looked ready to keep explaining, but the baseball bat in the main character's hand, brimming with killing intent, swept straight at him. The mysterious man hurriedly dodged to the side. "Kim Jaina, run now," he shouted at the top of his lungs. "What about you, big brother? Hurry," he roared at her again. By then, Kim Jaina was on the verge of tears, but she understood that staying would not help at all, and would only become another burden for her brother. So in the end, she had no choice but to turn around and run. That left the main character alone to face the masked man. Between them lay the monk, his life or death still unknown. His mind was stretched taut like a bowstring, as question after question pounded at him. Who was this man? Why had he come to the temple? What had he done to the monk? And was the old man still alive? The flood of questions threw him into chaos, but right now only one thing mattered most. He had to subdue the man in red first. Luckily, the stranger seemed unarmed, while Kim Jian was extremely skilled with the bat in his hands. "Damn it," the other man suddenly said. "I want to explain everything, but I do not have much time left, Kim Jian. I am truly sorry for pushing things this far." At that exact moment, a strange object suddenly appeared in the man's hand. It was a stone radiating a dazzling golden light. That light made the main character freeze, to the point that the bat in his hand lowered on its own, and in that very instant the man abruptly accelerated and charged straight at him. He clenched the stone in his palm and drove a heavy punch straight into Kim Jian's chest. At that suffocatingly close distance, he finally saw the other man's face clearly. "Kim Jian, go find Ania." He was even more horrified when he realized that although the man had white hair, that face looked exactly like his own. Right after that, the space around the main character suddenly shattered apart. The ground beneath his feet vanished, and he fell backward as if some force had dragged him into a bottomless abyss. Panic instantly swallowed him whole. He could not make a sound, and his consciousness slowly sank into darkness, until the main character finally woke up. The first thing that slammed to his vision as he cracked his eyes open was a skull and a horrifying giant centipede right beside it. The terrified scream of South Korea's most promising young soccer player echoed across the entire area. He jolted upright and staggered several steps back. A bleached white skeleton was right in front of him, so how could he not panic? But more importantly, he had no idea where he was. All he knew was that he had fallen into some bizarre place straight out of another world. When he pressed a hand to the ground to stand, the main character accidentally touched something. Turning his head, he saw a yellow cocoon encasing a larva, with vein-like tendrils wrapped around it and anchoring it tightly to the floor. Even worse, there was not just one cocoon. They had formed in clustered masses, and around the spot where the young man had fallen, there were dozens of those clusters. Faced with such a skin-crawling scene, he honestly wanted to pass out on the spot. Just when he still had no idea what to do next, the nearest cocoon suddenly split wide open. From inside, a larva that had already grown full limbs instantly shot out. It looked like a spider, but far more vicious and grotesque. Then came a rapid chorus of cracking sounds. The other cocoons began opening all at once as well, and it seemed that every last one of those monsters was moving straight ahead. More precisely, they were targeting Kim Jian with unmistakable hostility. In that situation, only one thought remained in his head. What the hell was going on here? Those bizarre creatures were clearly planning to attack the main character. Proof of that came when one of them suddenly leaped onto his arm. Then it drove its razor-sharp tail straight into his flesh. Kim Jian cried out in pain and flung his arm instinctively. A moment later, he managed to throw the thing clinging to him off his body, but it looked like he had already been hit by some kind of venom. The wound quickly swelled into an angry purple bruise, his veins bulged visibly, and his arm burned as if it were on fire. He had no idea what kind of monsters these bugs really were. He only knew that if he hesitated any longer, he would definitely die here. Kim Jian swept his eyes around and suddenly spotted that his baseball bat had fallen down with him as well. Without time to think, he rushed over and grabbed it. It was only sports gear, but in a life-or-death moment, it was still a weapon that could save him. And right now, every time the bat swung, the main character managed to knock back the swarm of bugs rushing at him. But their numbers were simply far too great. He could not deal with all of them at once. If he kept fighting here, sooner or later he would collapse from exhaustion. So Kim Jian had no choice but to find a way out of this place, and then he immediately turned and ran. Naturally, the grotesque insect monsters went into a frenzy and chased after him. Kim Jian ran with his head down for what felt like forever, but all around him were slick, damp rock walls that made every step painfully difficult. Kim Jian had absolutely no idea where he had fallen. It wasn't until he rushed to the edge of a pool that the protagonist vaguely realized he was most likely trapped inside a gigantic cave in another world. The swarm of bizarre insects behind him was still chasing close on his heels. At that point, he had nowhere left to retreat. With no other choice, he could only leave it to fate and jump straight into the water. Luckily, the young man had guessed right. Those bugs really could not dive into the water. But in the very next instant, he suddenly felt a horrifying, piercing pain. Wave after wave of agony shot straight up from both legs. Something beneath the water was continuously biting and tearing at his flesh. Helpless, the protagonist had no choice but to crawl back onto the shore. Clinging tightly to his legs were 4 or 5 disgusting creatures that looked like leeches. Their mouths packed with sharp teeth writhed as they sank deep into his flesh. The pain made his teeth grind together, and he wanted to scream what kind of hell this was, where every corner was crawling with monsters. Having known nothing but baseball his whole life, the young man had never seen or even heard of horrors like these. He was starting to wonder whether he was still in his old world at all. While frantically groping around in panic, the protagonist accidentally touched something. Looking closely, he realized it was the little doll Kim Jina had made for him. By now it was so torn up that the stuffing inside was spilling out. "Why is this here? Since when was it in my pocket?" He muttered bitterly about the useless lucky charm, because ever since this started, he had met nothing but bad luck. Yet the longer he looked at the doll, the heavier his heart became. He had no idea whether Kim Jin and Shithu, along with his teacher, were still safe. The face of that mysterious white-haired man surfaced in his mind again. He feared that after he had fallen down here, that man would continue targeting the people he cared about. A flood of negative emotions instantly tightened around his mind. But the protagonist quickly forced himself to calm down. Panicking would not change anything. Right now, action was the top priority. Even though the situation was as bad as it could get, he still firmly believed there had to be a way to survive. Just as he struggled to his feet and steadied himself, he suddenly felt something wet on his shoulder. A thick, slimy liquid dripped down from above and landed on the baseball bat resting across his shoulder. On instinct, he immediately looked up. What appeared was a giant spider, even more horrifying than any normal spider. It looked exactly like a monster from a fantasy world, its crimson mouth full of sharp teeth opening wide as if to swallow him whole. Kim Jian was so terrified that he fell flat onto his back. Looking closer, he saw that this monster did have the shape of a spider, but it also had 2 arms just like a human, making it clearly no ordinary creature. "I have to run," he thought to himself. Even so, the protagonist still tried to make full use of his powers of observation, and he spotted a narrow crack in the rock off in the distance that looked like his only way out. Not daring to hesitate any longer, he sprang up and bolted for it. That monster obviously had no intention of letting its prey go. It immediately chased right behind him. Just as the thing was about to grab him, the protagonist threw himself forward at full speed. He shot through the crack in the rock. The spider's oversized body was too large to squeeze through the tight stone passage. For the moment, it was blocked outside. Only its sharp legs could barely stab through, and they kept aggressively attacking him anyway. He had to press himself flat against the rock wall to dodge each thrust. He truly had no idea what kind of material this spider's body was made of, because wherever its legs struck, even solid stone was gouged out as easily as if it were tofu. He did not need to imagine how horrifying it would be if the protagonist's body took a hit from that. The two sides remained locked in a tense struggle for quite a while. In the end, no matter how hard the spider tried, it could not catch him and had no choice but to leave. Hiding in the crevice, he kept gasping for breath from the overwhelming tension. Only after the outside had gone quiet did the protagonist dare let out a slight sigh of relief. Just now, he really had thought he was as good as dead. But the trouble was far from over. The moment he relaxed even a little, he noticed that his arm had turned a deep purple. This was the injury caused earlier by the water bug, and now that arm had almost completely lost all feeling. The protagonist could only grit his teeth and curse inwardly. His situation was already hanging by a thread, and now he had to deal with a crippled arm too. It was unbelievably bad. He understood that he could not hide in here forever, so after gathering all his courage, he felt his way out of the cave. Soon after that, the protagonist found his bat again. No matter what, if he wanted to survive in this place, a weapon was absolutely essential. The spider had no idea where it had disappeared to. Kim Jin could no longer see it, but in the distance, a strange light had appeared, and within that glow, he faintly caught sight of a human figure. As if grabbing hold of a lifeline, he immediately shouted at the top of his lungs, "Over here! There's someone here!" As he shouted, the protagonist hurried toward that shadow. A small spark of luck flickered in his heart, because until now, he had thought he was the only one trapped in this cursed place. But the moment he rounded the rock corner and got a clear look at that figure, he froze once again. It was not a person, or rather, it had once been a person. Now it was only a corpse that had not fully decayed, with white bones exposed. A water bug was still attached to its head. The bizarre part was that the moment the protagonist appeared, that corpse viciously lunged at him as if it were still alive. Even though he was so scared his head was spinning, he was at least calm enough to know how he needed to dodge in a situation like this. The skeleton charged in and missed its target. Because of that, he clearly saw the venomous proboscis of the bug buried deep in the back of the corpse's neck. Parasite. That single word immediately flashed through the protagonist's mind. Whatever that thing was, the best way to take it down was to crush it. Thinking that, he immediately swung the bat in his hand with all his might. Pouring every ounce of strength he had into it, he brought down a savage blow. But things did not go the way he wanted, because the thing that shattered from that strike was, Kim Jian tightened his grip on the baseball bat, the same one that had once helped him win the high school championship. The protagonist's move just now had obviously driven that parasitic monster into a frenzy. Together with its skeletal host, it slowly turned its head back toward him. Then it suddenly burst forward. It opened its jaws and bit straight into his shoulder. The pain that stabbed all the way to his bones only made this young man's rage erupt even harder. This time he reacted at once and shoved it away with all his strength. The skeleton was flung off to one side, but the moment it regained its footing, it lunged at him again. Its speed was unbelievably fast, so fast that the protagonist didn't even have time to dodge. On instinct, he had no choice but to raise his arm to block. As a result, he got bitten again. This time it was even more dangerous than before. Blood immediately began pouring nonstop from his arm, forcing himself to endure the agony drilling into his bones. The protagonist groped around wildly and felt his hand touch a rock. He gathered all his strength and hurled it straight at the parasitic bug perched on top of the skeleton's head. The blow made the entire grotesque creature stagger before collapsing to the ground. Seizing that exact moment, he rushed forward without hesitation. Using the rock as a weapon, he slammed it down on his prey again and again like a madman. This young man's overwhelming will to survive exploded with terrifying force. And in the end, he actually managed to bring that monster down. The protagonist was so exhausted that he could barely catch his breath. He thought it was finally over, but right after that, a barrage of hurried footsteps echoed out. When he looked up, an entire army of corpses was already standing in front of him. There were animal carcasses and human bodies alike, but they all shared one thing in common. Every last one had been taken over by parasitic insects, and he could only silently curse his fate. Even so, the protagonist absolutely refused to die in this hellish place. After taking a deep breath, he let out a roar and charged ferociously straight at the undead horde. The whole mass surged at him at once. In moments, they had completely surrounded him. The beast corpses clamped their jaws tightly onto protagonist's legs. Meanwhile, the human corpses desperately pinned down his upper body. He was completely unarmed. On top of that, he was all alone in the middle of their encirclement. Facing that many monsters was clearly far beyond his limits. Not to mention, the appearance of those things was revolting beyond words. Anyone with a weak stomach probably would have passed out long ago. Even though he struggled with everything he had for a while, he was ultimately still beaten to the ground. Watching the undead hurl themselves at him again, the protagonist almost wanted to sigh. Was this really how it would end, with him dying here and becoming the same kind of grotesque thing as them? Interesting. Right at that moment, a voice suddenly echoed down from empty space. His heart gave a violent jolt. He immediately darted his eyes toward the source of that voice. What appeared was almost impossible to believe. It was the doll Kim Jaina had once made for the protagonist, and it was now floating in midair. An eerie blue flame burned above the doll's head and one of its eyes was blazing as well. He felt like he was on the verge of going insane. Otherwise, how could he possibly be hearing a doll speak? Even crazier, he actually spoke back to it. More precisely, he asked it directly, "What the hell are you? Does that even matter now? You're standing right at death's door. Take hold of me. If you do, you'll live." As soon as it finished speaking, the doll's whole body ignited and transformed into a dazzling blue flame. Within that sea of fire, only a faint eye remained, ceaselessly urging the protagonist to touch it. In front of him was a bizarre flame of completely unknown origin. Behind him was a murderous horde of undead radiating overwhelming killing intent. The protagonist did not need much time to make his choice. He instantly dashed toward that flame as fast as he could, and caught it just in time, right before the undead could lay their hands on him. With a thunderous boom, a massive explosion erupted at once. It blasted the entire undead horde far away. What had just been floating there like a wandering flame now existed in his hand in a completely different form. It had turned into a baseball bat. It looked fairly ornate, but in the protagonist's eyes, it was still just a bat. It could hardly even be considered a weapon. He wondered if fate was mocking him. Again and again, it kept driving him into despair. That explosion had only managed to knock the undead down for a very short time. Now they were already howling again and charging straight at the protagonist in a roaring wave. There was no other choice. He could only swing the bat in his hand with all his might. And at that very moment, he realized just how completely different this bat was from the old one. The previous bat had shattered the instant it struck an undead corpse. but this thing was unimaginably durable. With a single blow, it could crush the enemy's body. There was not even the slightest chip left on the bat itself. The protagonist could also clearly feel a source of power rising inside his body. Could it all really be coming from this seemingly ordinary bat? He wasn't sure, and he had no idea what was really happening. But if he had this in his hands, then maybe he truly could do it. I definitely can. He forced himself to believe exactly that. No matter what kind of otherworld this was, no matter where the bat had come from, and no matter why he had to endure all of this. From this moment on, none of that mattered anymore. The only thing the protagonist needed to do now was crush every enemy in his path and survive. And that was exactly what he thought. It was also exactly what he did. Even if the price he paid was a tremendous amount of stamina, by the time there were no more waves of attacks, the space around him had already been completely transformed into a blood-soaked battlefield. Not a single monster corpse remained intact under that power. The combined strength of the mysterious bat and the protagonist was truly overwhelming. He stood there in silence, staring at the thing in his hand for a long time. He could feel that surging source of power coursing throughout his body, and he wondered whether this was some kind of magic or perhaps a system ability. But something even more terrifying was still waiting behind it all, because the thing in his hand transformed once again into that same strange, mystical blue flame from before. That flame suddenly twisted in on itself, then transformed into a monster with a gaping maw and rows of razor-sharp teeth. It all happened right in front of Kim Jan's eyes. The sight was so horrifying that he couldn't stop himself from letting out a panicked scream. But the creature born from that spark of fire didn't lunge at the main character to attack him. Instead, it began devouring the monster corpses scattered all around the area, one after another without pause. Watching that grotesque thing gorge itself on the bodies as if it meant to swallow everything whole, the young man could only stand there in stunned disbelief. When the process finally came to an end, it shrank back down into the shape of a staff and settled neatly into his hand. The main character kept his eyes locked on that bizarre object, unable to look away for even a second. At that exact moment, a violent pain suddenly clamped down on his chest. The agony was so overwhelming that his entire body buckled and nearly collapsed on the spot. He writhed in misery. It passed quickly, but the after effects it left behind were intensely unpleasant. All the main character could do was gasp for breath in heavy, ragged bursts. Then, all of a sudden, he realized the wound on his arm was slowly disappearing. And it wasn't just his arm. His entire body was recovering as well, at a speed so obvious it could be seen with the naked eye. Even the tiniest scratches were sealing shut. The main character could feel his body growing stronger in a deeply unnatural way. Could this also be one of that system staff's powers? If that was true, then this thing was an unbelievable treasure. With it in his hands, he finally began to feel a spark of hope that he might survive in this deadly otherworld. Even though the immediate threat to his life had passed for the moment, there was still another problem that was just as serious. He was absolutely starving, and if he wanted to survive, the first thing he needed was something to eat. So the young man immediately swept his gaze around the area in search of food. The first thing the main character spotted was a cluster of mushrooms growing nearby. Given his current situation, they were pretty much the only realistic option he had to fill his stomach. But when he looked at those mushrooms glowing far too brightly in front of him, he started worrying all over again about whether they might be poisonous. It was a brutally tense battle inside his own head, and after struggling with himself for a while, he finally surrendered to his hunger. He told himself it would be better to die from poison than turn into a starving ghost in this dungeon. So the main character immediately stuffed the mushrooms into his mouth and wolfed them down. The unexpectedly delicious taste left him frozen in surprise. After waiting a while with no signs of poisoning, it seemed his desperate gamble had paid off perfectly. For the time being, food was more or less taken care of. When he got hungry, he ate mushrooms. When he got thirsty, he drank water from the lake, even though from time to time he still had to come face to face with those hellish insects crawling all over the place nearby. In truth, under survival conditions this brutal, it wouldn't have been strange at all if the main character had fallen sick long ago. But perhaps because of the staff's mysterious effect, he had remained safe and sound until now. Even life inside that harsh cavern became a little more bearable thanks to that incomprehensible power. But just as he was starting to adapt to life underground, monsters began closing in on him again and again, as if to remind him that this was no longer his old world. After observing them long enough, he realized these insects seemed to live as parasites on the corpses of other creatures. Even though they had hard shells, their weak points were exposed and easy to hit. At this point, taking them down was no longer especially difficult for the main character. Of course, every bit of that progress was thanks to this bizarre staff. Every time Kim Jian killed a monster, the staff in his hand would immediately devour the remains, eating everything clean without leaving a trace. Then, once it returned to its normal state, his body would be healed and grow stronger again. Little by little, he adapted to this living hell and regained hope that he might actually survive. But that hope was shaken once again when the main character ran into that monster. Countless dangers lurked inside the cave, but the most terrifying of them all was definitely this thing. A half-spider, half-human monster that had nearly taken his life before. Fortunately, it only wandered around the monster nest once in a while. Aside from that, it didn't seem to be making any other moves. He had spent a long time circling around inside the cave to avoid that thing, but he still couldn't find a way out. In the end, he arrived at only one possible conclusion. The exit was most likely on the opposite side of the nest, the place where he had fallen down. The problem was that if the main character wanted to get there, he would have to cross that area packed with those horrifying cocoons. Even though he could deal with bugs and monsters now, that place was still a true hell in his eyes. On top of that, he was afraid of running into the most dangerous enemy of all, that half-human, half-spider monster. He didn't believe he could beat it, and even if he somehow managed to escape, no one could say for sure that he would return to where his family was. The thought of being trapped in this hell forever sent a chill down the main character's spine. Of course, he refused to accept that, so he began retracing everything from the beginning to figure out how he had been dragged here. He remembered clearly that he had been standing on flat ground at the time, then suddenly lost his footing and fell. On top of that, the man in the temple who had a face exactly like his had to be connected somehow. The main character also vaguely remembered that the man had told him to go find something. He squeezed his eyes shut and shook his head, trying to cast away the mess of tangled thoughts. Now wasn't the time to get lost in all that, because the most important thing at this moment was getting out first. He had made up his mind. He was going back to that hellish area filled with things that would terrify any normal person out of their wits. The kind of place where just seeing all those holes was enough to make someone's skin crawl and make them faint. The main character swept his eyes over the area and confirmed one thing. That gigantic monster wasn't here at the moment. It seemed luck hadn't completely abandoned him after all. On top of that, the bugs inside the cocoons didn't seem to be showing any signs of agitation either. Even the ones that had already crawled out of their shells were strangely quiet. That made him believe even more that he might be able to leave this place smoothly. But just as he thought that, he accidentally stepped on a dry bone and snapped it clean in half. That sharp crack made the main character go so rigid he almost stopped breathing. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds passed. The space around him remained utterly silent. It seemed that neither the giant monster nor the swarm of bugs had heard the sound just now. Meanwhile, he was trembling all over. Even so, he still began inching forward little by little. At this moment, the only thing the main character wanted was to get out of this foul, horrifying place as fast as possible. Even after pressing deeper toward the end, all he saw were cocoons covering everything in sight, and not a single trace of an exit. His mood inevitably sank in disappointment. Could this place really be a dead end? But above him, light was clearly shining down. That proved this place connected to the outside world. So if he wanted to escape, his only option left was to climb up. The problem was that he had absolutely no idea how he was supposed to do that. Kim Ji-yeon edged one more step forward, just to get a clearer look at the strange light shining ahead. But the instant his foot came down, he stepped on something. A chill shot down the protagonist's spine, and only one thought remained in his head: I'm dead for sure. Because the thing this young man had just stepped on was the lower body of that demonic spider, the very spider-shaped monster he had feared most since the moment he entered the dungeon. A shrill screech tore through the air. The monster's foreleg came slashing straight at him like a blade. Just one strike was enough to send the protagonist flying backward. He could even taste blood surging up into his mouth. Kim Ji-yeon's body slammed hard against the ground, and all he could do was grit his teeth and curse under his breath. Turns out this guy's rotten luck had dragged him straight into the enemy's nest. The intrusion had completely ignited the monster's fury. It began closing in on him one step at a time. Then it suddenly opened its mouth wide and unleashed a piercing shriek so horrifying it made anyone who heard it break out in goosebumps. Kim Ji-yeon's whole body ached, but he still forced himself up by bracing his staff against the ground. He refused to collapse here. Taking a deep breath, the protagonist tightened his grip on his weapon and swung again. This blow carved a wound into the monster's leg and hot yellow fluid poured out, proof that his strength was nothing like before. Well, now it's your turn to have a taste. Advancing while taunting it, he lowered his center of gravity like a batter preparing to swing and gripped the handle tightly in both hands. There was no telling whether that monster understood human speech, but his fighting spirit and mocking tone were enough to drive it completely mad. A moment ago it had been moving in slowly, but now it lunged forward like it had lost its mind. Thanks to his experience tracking baseball trajectories, the protagonist had always had sharp eyes and trusted his ability to read movement, but this monster's speed had clearly reached a whole different level. Even so, with the staff in his hands supporting him, his vision seemed to sharpen another degree, and the instant the target entered range, he struck with perfect precision. Another shrill cry rang out at once, but this time it was filled with the monster's pain. It immediately recoiled several steps. Another fresh wound had appeared on its leg. Seeing himself land hit after hit, and even deal visible damage to his enemy, Kim Ji-yeon gradually regained the confidence he once had on the baseball field and told himself he could still win this fight. The two sides froze for a few seconds, as if sizing up each other's strength. Then that spider opened its mouth again and let out the same familiar screech. That was the signal for a new assault, but this time it did not charge straight in. The moment he realized something was off, the protagonist felt the ground beneath his feet begin to tremble. It was as if thousands thousands of legs were racing this way at full speed all at once. The swarm of bugs that had stayed motionless until now had been awakened by the Spider Queen's scream. They came flooding in behind her. Just the sight of those countless writhing insects was enough to make anyone's skin crawl. Kim Ji-yeon broke out in goosebumps instantly. This situation was outrageously unfair. Those monsters were obviously trying to crush him with sheer numbers, but he had no choice left except to fight. The staff in Kim Ji-yeon's hands began working at full force. It kept crashing down without pause. The protagonist fought until his vision blurred and sweat poured off him like rain. The battle kept turning worse and the ground was already piled high with bug corpses. Meanwhile, Kim Ji-yeon's stamina was steadily running dry, and the monsters' numbers were still hopelessly overwhelming. On top of that, the Spider Queen was still there. If this kept dragging on, the battle would never end. And this young man did not have the strength to keep it up forever. He hurried to think of a way to break the stalemate, but in just a single moment of distraction, the spider monster's razor-sharp leg stabbed straight through his chest. The feeling of his body being pierced brought a pain so horrific it defied description. The agony nearly paralyzed Kim Ji-yeon on the spot, so intense he almost wanted to black out, but his mind remained strangely clear. Right at the moment when the Spider Queen's leg was still pinned deep inside his body, the protagonist used every last bit of strength to raise his baseball bat. Then he hacked down with all his might, snapping that leg in half and severing it from the monster's body. The monster instantly let out a scream of pain, and Kim Ji-yeon hurriedly pulled the broken leg out of his own body. Hot fluid and blood poured down onto the ground like rain. He frantically pressed his hand over the wound, but this stab had been far too severe. The effects of blood loss hit him with terrifying speed. The proof was how rapidly his vision was going dim. Meanwhile, the Spider Queen had lost only one leg, so her combat power was still terrifying, and behind her stood a densely packed horde of monsters. Kim Ji-yeon kept gasping for breath. Blood still gushed from the wound, and he muttered in despair, "Is this really as far as I can go?" He felt like he had absolutely no chance of winning. What else can I possibly do? Just how much more do you people expect me to endure? Fight. A familiar voice suddenly rang out in Kim Ji-yeon's mind, making him jolt in shock. In that instant, the protagonist seemed to see Kim Ji-yeon's face, wearing a seriousness that was almost hard to believe. "Don't even think about giving up here." Kim Ji-yeon? No way. Kim Ji-yeon thought he was only hallucinating from blood loss, but the girl in the school uniform kept urging him on. "Get up now." Jin Ji-yeon's voice rang out, as if pulling the protagonist back from the abyss of despair. The little girl and her master were waiting for him to rise and fight back, but that face suddenly dissolved into nothing. All he could see before him was that familiar blue haze, circling his body like some mysterious source of magic. The young man instantly snapped back to his senses. It felt as if his entire body had just been flooded with fighting spirit. He hurriedly grabbed the staff that had just fallen to the ground. Not far away, that blue mist also charged into battle alongside him. Because this thing's power was clearly no joke, the swarm of water bug monsters had only just touched the veil of mist. They were immediately blasted away. In that instant, the protagonist and the blue haze seemed to merge into a single unified being. His power surged explosively, and his confidence flared with it. The bugs in front of him no longer seemed frightening at all. His voice overflowed with arrogance, completely unlike the trembling, panicked version of himself from just moments ago. Seeing its opponent stand back up, the spider demon instantly let out a roar, as if trying to assert its dominance. But this time, Jin Jian's mind was no longer shaken by that terrifying howl. He even accelerated and charged straight in. His speed was incredible, and his strikes were decisive and ruthless. The staff in the protagonist's hand swept through the air, carving a beautiful arc that was packed with killing intent. Only after he fully came to his senses did he realize that the monstrous spider had already collapsed at his feet. Jin Jian was so stunned he nearly fell backward. What the hell had just happened? Why had he suddenly become this strong? The protagonist looked toward the light at the end of the cave. He froze on the spot. The exit was right in front of him. Just a little farther, and he could escape this place. His hand tightened around the staff, which was giving off a faint blue glow. The young man's eyes widened, his shock clearly visible in his gaze. Jin Jian watched the dazzling blue phantom rush toward the monster's corpse, and he vaguely wondered what it was trying to do. It opened its mouth and gently devoured the monster's body lying on the ground. He frowned in confusion at that bizarre and eerie sight. He watched the phantom slowly turn back and merge into the staff in his hand. No matter how many times he saw it, he still couldn't get used to it. The blue energy immediately flowed toward the protagonist's hand and gathered there. The moment it rushed into his body, he instantly doubled over and let out a pained groan. Jin Jian lowered his head and looked at the flash of light coming from the wound on his chest. He dropped to his knees on the ground and darted his eyes around. The wound really was closing, but the pain was still so intense that he couldn't get used to it. The protagonist gripped the staff and stood up. In his mind, only one thought mattered more than anything else: this power. He lowered his head and clenched his fist. The energy he had just absorbed was clearly on a completely different level from the monsters before. Could it be that his growth depended on the strength of his opponent? Right after that, Jin Jian's face turned extremely serious as he stared straight ahead. He fixed his eyes on the cave entrance. Even though he still had no idea what the future held in this other world, he was determined to keep moving forward. The protagonist firmly gripped the staff in his hand. He raised a hand to shield himself from the blinding sunlight and stepped outside. With this power, he would definitely find a way to survive. But at that very moment, the young man suddenly stopped and widened his eyes at the sight before him. This was... Jin Jian stared at the endless sea of golden sand stretching before his eyes. A desert? He raised his fist and tried to steady himself. A desert was definitely a disaster, but at least it was still better than that damp cave full of monsters. Sometime later, the protagonist had already collapsed to his knees on the scorching sand. His entire body felt drained and dried out, and all he could do was lower his head and lament just how badly he had misjudged things. Jin Jian could only drag himself forward one step at a time. This place was even more desolate than he had imagined. No food, and no water either. The land before him was dry in a way that felt utterly hopeless. The earlier scenes replayed in his mind. The only things he had ever encountered were walking skeletons and monsters, and now even that no longer surprised him. The protagonist's eyes were bloodshot and red. After fighting this hard just to survive, was he really going to end up starving to death? In the end, Jin Jian collapsed onto the sand in despair. Since arriving here, he had not seen a single living soul. The only things shaped like humans were monsters. He looked up at the sky and sighed. Could it be that humanity in this world had already gone completely extinct? The protagonist's eyes slowly closed. He could only hope that the next time he opened them, all of this would turn out to be a nightmare. Just as he was about to give up, an unexpected voice rang out, making him snap his eyes open. "Hey, there's someone over there." Seeing that, Erez, who was standing behind her, immediately warned Chloe not to recklessly approach someone whose background was still unknown. The little girl kept smiling brightly at Jin Jian and cried out, "He's still alive." Right after that, Chloe clutched her chest and grumbled in exasperation. Looking at the protagonist's tear-streaked face, she complained that he was making such a scene that he was about to make her cry too. He looked toward the two of them and stammered in reply. But Jin Jian threw his head back and looked at the sky, tears and snot all over his face as he shouted, "You two are the first humans I've met since I came here, and on top of that, we can actually understand each other." Seeing that, Chloe could only let out a horrified yelp. Erez was much calmer. He suggested that everyone settle down first, then rest and talk at the same time. Hearing that, Chloe immediately turned and protested. "What? We still have a long way to go, and you already want to stop and rest?" Erez looked down seriously and said that the young man was overwhelmed because he had met them, so they could not just leave him behind and walk away. Besides, Chloe had been the first one to run over in excitement. Chloe instantly fell silent, then pouted in clear dissatisfaction. After that, she crossed her arms, turned to look at Jin Jian, and reluctantly agreed. Erez only smiled and said that was the right decision. That night, the three of them gathered together and began preparing dinner. The smell of food from the pot bubbling away quickly spread everywhere. The protagonist's brows drew tightly together as he stared at it. What the hell was this? Then his eyes instantly lit up with hunger. How long had it been since he had last seen real food? Chloe looked at that expression and complained, "Good grief, you look like someone who's been starving for days." Hearing that, Jin Jian started drooling and replied, "I haven't eaten anything for more than 5 days. The little girl was so shocked she could hardly believe it. How could you possibly have survived that long? Erez also looked at him with a serious expression. The protagonist immediately raised his fist and explained, "I'm not really sure either, but maybe it's because I absorbed those monsters." Chloe looked at the soup pot on the fire and continued, "Absorbed them? That sounds like a kind of magic I've never heard of." The moment he heard that, he immediately asked in excitement, "So magic really does exist here?" Chloe turned her head toward him and shot back, "So where exactly did you come from?" Hearing that, he lowered his head and looked at the ground, not even knowing where to begin explaining. Erez picked up a bowl of soup and handed it to the protagonist, telling him to eat first. His story could come out little by little while they ate. In the blink of an eye, Jin Jian had already gulped down the entire bowl of soup he had just been given. He instinctively hunched his neck when he heard the probing voice ask, "So you came from another world, and when you woke up, you found yourself here?" Erez looked down at the ground and asked another question. "And by defeating monsters with that weapon, your body heals and you become stronger, right?" He looked at Jin Jian and frankly praised it as a truly extraordinary ability. Chloe suddenly swept her gaze around, her face full of suspicion. She realized night had already fallen completely, yet the undead were eerily silent for some inexplicable reason. Jin Jian slammed his staff against the ground once, then answered calmly, "That's because..." He broke into a bright smile, looked at the two of them, and proudly showed it off. "I already cleaned them all up with this." Chloe whipped around at once, so shocked she could hardly believe it, and could only blurt out, "What?" Erez studied the protagonist intently, then said thoughtfully, "The undead in this region revive every night, and no matter how many times they're destroyed, it's useless." His gaze stopped on the strange staff. He said it absorbed the undead, and sure enough, they hadn't moved at all even after dark fell. Could that weapon really have a special power? His brows drew together slightly. Maybe it really did. Facing them, he glanced at Chloe and offered, "Let me help finish cleaning up too." But the girl immediately brushed him off and said there was no need. Ayers quickly stood up and let out a relieved sigh. "Thanks to you, we'll actually be able to sleep soundly tonight," he continued. "If you don't have anywhere to go yet, why not travel with us for now? We'll also look for a way to send you back to your old world." Hearing that, Chloe, who was standing beside him, immediately protested in dissatisfaction. What Ayers? But he only stared seriously at the protagonist. Under that stare, he grew flustered for a moment and could only stammer, well. Right after that, Jinjian lifted his head, flashed a radiant smile and replied, "I'd be honored." As for Chloe, she hugged the stack of bowls tighter and huffily turned her face away. The next morning, she swung her knife and chopped straight into the cactus trunk in front of her. Chloe quickly gathered every piece that fell off, then neatly stored them in the pouch at her waist. Seeing that, Jinjian laughed in admiration. "So you can actually eat that stuff. You really know a lot, Chloe." The girl immediately raised her knife high with a smug look. "Of course, if you want to cross this barren desert, that much is just basic knowledge." But when she turned and saw the protagonist resting his chin on his hand with a gentle smile as he watched her, Chloe froze, then snapped, "What are you staring at?" After that, he hoisted the staff onto his shoulder and strolled over. "You really remind me of my little sister from back then." At that, the girl immediately objected. "I'm grown up, okay." And just like that, the young man officially joined Chloe and Ayers on their journey. Along the way, he hurried a few steps forward and casually asked if those hands were real. Chloe answered in surprise, asking if his world didn't have them. He softly denied it, saying his world had nothing like that. During their time traveling together, the protagonist gradually learned countless things about this other world. From Chloe, who called herself a beastkin, Jinjian learned all kinds of survival knowledge and common sense about this fantasy world. She curiously asked what races existed where he came from. He answered that there were only humans. Chloe instantly widened her eyes and gasped, "What, that's it?" The girl lifted her head toward the man walking ahead and shouted, "Ayers." And from Ayers, Jinjian began learning about monster habits and hunter-style combat techniques. The middle-aged man sheathed his sword and smiled as he asked, "You two are back." Looking at the other two, he thought to himself, they said the goal of this journey was to take down the leader of the monster pack. Chloe trotted over to claim credit. "I brought food." Ayers patted her head and praised her. "Good job." Watching that scene, the protagonist smiled faintly and thought to himself, "I really am lucky." Looking at how cheerful the two of them were, he thought that even if he still didn't fully understand the people of this world, everyone he'd met so far had to be good people. That night, a crescent moon hung quietly high in the sky. Jinjian lowered his gaze to the tiny undead plush beast lying in his hand. He lay on his back with one leg crossed over the other, studying that strange item with full attention. Suddenly, a voice rang out and pulled the protagonist's attention away. "Can't sleep." Ayers stood right in front of him, holding an oil lamp. Jinjian wore a heavy expression and answered softly, "I've got too many things on my mind." He gently set the lamp on the ground and asked, "Missing home?" Then Ayers slowly sat down beside him as well, his tone full of curiosity. He looked over at Chloe, who was sleeping soundly, then continued, "I've lived in this world for a very long time, but you're the first person from another world I've ever met." Jinjian closed his eyes, tried to stay calm, and said, "Compared to this place, that world is actually pretty dull." Ayers merely smiled warmly at that. "Then it must be a very peaceful place." After hearing that, he lowered his head in silence and sank even deeper into homesickness. Jinjian's thoughts kept spiraling deeper. "Only now do I realize how peaceful the place I used to live in really was, and my resolve to return has only grown stronger. No matter what I have to do, I'm going back." Then he spoke up and asked, "Have you ever heard of baseball?" Ayers looked briefly surprised. "Baseball?" The next morning, he and Chloe clung to each other and screamed as they stared at the dragon's giant leaf-like maw. In the protagonist's mind, only one thought remained. Anything is fine, as long as I don't die. Chloe and Jinjian ran headlong straight ahead, not even daring to look back. While running, his steps suddenly halted. "Keep going, Chloe." The girl turned back and looked at Jinjian in worry. The protagonist raised his staff, fixed his eyes on the giant leaf dragon and shouted, "Hurry." He gritted his teeth, tightened his grip on the staff, and raised it high, waiting for the monster to charge. Right after that, he put all his strength into a savage blow and smashed the staff down onto its head. The dragon frowned slightly and turned its gaze toward him. As for him, he clenched his teeth and glared straight at it without blinking. The dragon's massive foot slammed into the ground, splitting the earth apart as if it had just been struck by a devastating blow. It swung its razor-sharp claws and attacked the spot where Jinjian was standing. The hit sent him flying, and a pained groan escaped his mouth. The protagonist's whole body crashed hard into the ground, kicking up thick clouds of dust and sand everywhere. The moment Chloe looked back and saw that, she screamed in panic, "Jinjian!" He clutched his stomach, his whole body curling up from the pain. A moment later, Jinjian narrowed his eyes, then lifted his head and stared at the dragon. The monster had its mouth wide open and was charging straight at him, as if it meant to swallow everything whole. Suddenly, the protagonist's eyes flew wide open in shock. Just when it was only a short distance away from him, the dragon's body was sliced cleanly into two halves. Jinjian froze on the spot, staring at the enormous corpse as it crashed to the ground right in front of him. When he looked up, he saw the man with the sword slowly walking toward him. Uncle Ayers. Ayers quickly sheathed his sword and asked with concern, "Are you okay?" Chloe also rushed over and immediately complained, "Why did you get here so late?" The girl looked at him anxiously and asked if he was hurt anywhere. Half sitting and half kneeling on the ground, Jinjian replied that he was fine, just a little scraped up. But as for this thing, a stream of blue light suddenly surged out from inside the staff. A gigantic phantom appeared, opened its jagged jaws wide, and lunged forward to bite into the dragon. Ayers and Chloe, who were standing nearby, were stunned speechless by the unbelievable sight. The blue light flashed, then touched the wounds on Jinjian's hand and face. In the blink of an eye, every injury on his body vanished completely, as if they had never existed. Seeing that, Chloe excitedly ran over and fired off questions. "What was that just now? Was that the absorption ability you mentioned before?" After hearing her out, he only smiled lightly and replied, "Yeah, something like that." Ayers watched the dragon's corpse disappear, then murmured thoughtfully. Its body and even its magic power vanished without leaving a trace. Right after that, he slowly turned his head and stared fixedly at the protagonist. Ayers narrowed his eyes slightly and silently studied Jinjian, as if weighing something extremely important. Suddenly, his voice rang out as he called to him, making the young man look over at once. "Come here." Ayers kept his serious expression and said bluntly, "There's something I want to ask your help with." Hearing that, Chloe and Jinjian both stared at him at the same time, curiously waiting for what came next. But the moment she heard it, the girl's expression changed, and she shouted in fury, "Are you out of your mind?" Even so, Ayers' face remained ice cold, without the slightest trace of emotion. Sitting beside the campfire, Jinjian heard Chloe cry out in disbelief. "What? You're seriously telling him to go capture a trick lizard?" Just thinking of that monster's figure made the girl panic even more as she shouted, "You'd be better off telling him to go die." Chloe frowned and pointed straight at him, sharply demanding to know why he was not dealing with the Lich himself like they had planned from the start. Ayers lowered his head slightly and reassured her to relax, saying that if the main character refused, he absolutely would not force him. Hearing that, the girl instantly bristled and snapped at him not to be ridiculous. Did he not know how strong that Lich was, and that idiot definitely had no clue either? Just as the tension in the air was peaking, Kim Jian's voice suddenly rang out and made the girl freeze. "Fine then, I'll give it a shot." Ayers and Chloe both whipped their heads around toward him at the exact same time. Kim Jian leaned on his staff with one hand and asked with a grin, "So what exactly do I need to do first?" That afternoon, he took such a huge bite of bread that both cheeks puffed out as he chewed. While chewing, the young man glanced over and asked again as if confirming it, "You mean a real test, right?" He stared at Ayers in silence, not saying another word. Chloe was chewing too, but she frowned in confusion, clearly wondering why he suddenly wanted to confirm something like this. From the higher spot where he stood, Ayers looked down and asked in return, had she not said before that Kim Jian still did not fully understand his own power? Kim Jian frowned and studied Ayers carefully for a moment, then nodded in confirmation. That was true. Only then did Ayers slowly explain that before facing the Lich, he needed to understand Kim Jian's abilities in greater detail. Ayers continued, saying he wanted to know how that power actually worked at its core. Chloe had just opened her mouth to take another bite when she heard him add that they also needed to test where Kim Jian's limits really were. Kim Jian lowered his head to look at the staff beside him and muttered thoughtfully, "Sure, because I'm really curious about that myself." He stared hard at the weapon in his hand, wondering what kind of bizarre power this staff was actually hiding. Right after that, Kim Jian clenched his fist and declared in a clear voice, "All right then, how do we get started?" He dropped to his knees on the ground with a deeply puzzled expression, his eyes fixed on what was below. Next, Kim Jian lifted his head and narrowed his eyes toward the opposite side. Still holding that same posture, he quietly asked in confusion, "What is this thing anyway?" Smiling brightly, Chloe explained that it was a tool used to test his magic power. The moment he heard that, Kim Jian jolted in shock. "What, you mean I have magic power too?" Resting her chin on her hand, the girl replied that he most likely did, because everyone possessed magic power. From behind him, Ayers added with a smile that he would do a basic check, and maybe they could uncover the true nature of that strange staff and Kim Jian's magic. At that, Kim Jian flushed bright red and hugged himself tightly, stammering as he asked if they were doing it right here and now, forcing Ayers to hurriedly clarify that he did not mean that. Ayers stepped forward, placed a hand on his shoulder, and continued by saying that he only intended to examine him. He set both hands on Kim Jian's shoulders and explained that he was about to release a stream of magic power. Ars closed his eyes and focused, carefully sensing the flow of energy moving inside Kim Jian's body. A moment later, his consciousness seemed to plunge straight into the main character's body. Ars was instantly stunned when he saw a blue phantom floating before him, and he could not stop himself from blurting out, "What the hell is that thing?" In the very next second, the thing opened its mouth wide and lunged straight at him. In the blink of an eye, Ars had no choice but to yank his hands off Kim Jian's shoulders. He narrowed his eyes and stared in shock at Kim Jian's back. Kim Jian turned around and asked blankly, "Is it over already?" He eagerly pressed for an answer. "So, what happened? Did you find anything?" Ars looked down at his own hand and shook his head with regret, saying he had not been able to see anything at all. Hearing that, Kim Jian also let out a disappointed sigh. "Oh really? That's too bad." Looking at Kim Jian's bright smile, Ars fell into thought. This was hard to classify as simple magic power. It felt more like another living creature was dwelling inside his body. Urs slightly narrowed his eyes and judged inwardly that he had only tried to sense Kim Jian's magic, yet the rejection reaction had already been this intense. While silently calculating what that source of power might be, Kim Jian turned with a cheerful grin and asked Chloe whether she could use magic too, and she immediately shook her head no. Looking at that harmless smile, Ars could only think to himself that this young man was far more dangerous than he appeared. Elsewhere, a dried-up corpse clutching an axe staggered forward at a quick, uneven pace. The instant it heard movement, it immediately turned its head to look to the side. Right then, a stone came flying in fast and smashed directly into the dried corpse's head. Its entire rotting body was knocked flat onto its back. Kim Jian kept hurling stones without stopping, while thinking that it had already been quite a while since he had fallen into this other world. After that, he lightly squeezed the stone in his palm and calculated to himself that, though he did not remember exactly, it had probably been more than 3 months. Kim Jian looked at the blue phantom gnawing on the dried corpse and wondered how many monsters he had absorbed during that time. He lowered his gaze to his own palm and could clearly feel that his current body had already gone far beyond normal human limits. Right then, a voice suddenly called out Kim Jian's name from behind him. Hearing the call, he immediately glanced back. This place was obviously crawling with grotesque monsters, but still. Chloe came over carrying a basket of bread and happily called everyone to eat, making Kim Jian think that he had endured everything so far because of the companions by his side. In the blink of an eye, the bowl had been scraped completely clean and left sitting there empty on the ground. Kim Jian wore a satisfied smile and let out a happy cheer. He rubbed his stomach and leaned back, marveling that his hunger had finally been crushed. Kim Jian did not forget to grin and praise Chloe, saying her cooking was always amazing, which made her cross her arms proudly and declare that this much was only basic stuff. He smiled brightly and asked whether there would be anything delicious again tonight, and Chloe immediately shouted back that he should get ready to be amazed. Seeing that, Ars could only marvel inwardly that Kim Jian really knew how to sweet-talk a kid, and had even smoothly pushed the cooking duty onto her. After that, Ars spoke up and asked, "Hey, how far has the training I taught you progressed?" Kim Jian raised one finger, thought back for a moment, and asked, "You mean that magic control thing?" With a disappointed look, he answered that things were not going as hoped, because he could not feel anything at all. Kim Jian continued gloomily that maybe he just had no talent for this, while Ars silently reflected that the request might really have been too much for him. Looking at his dejected expression, Ars thought that Kim Jian truly did not seem like someone gifted in magic, almost exactly like he had once been, while Kim Jian muttered that he had dreamed of becoming like Harry Potter too. Ars gently comforted him, saying not to get discouraged, because it seemed Kim Jian was gradually being influenced by magic power already, which made him immediately ask in excitement if that was true. Smiling, Ars replied that if he kept trying, sooner or later he would be able to control magic power. Kim Jian instantly rolled up his sleeves and said with excitement that even if he still could not control magic power, he had already grown much stronger, so when they fought the Lich he could still help, right? Chloe also cast a probing look toward Ars, waiting for his answer. Ars stayed silent and looked at him for a long time, as if weighing something in his mind. In the end, right before Kim Jian's astonished eyes, Ars shook his head and denied it, saying Kim Jian would not be fighting the Lich directly. His voice continued as he explained that by ordinary standards, Kim Jian was already fairly strong. But Ars looked at Kim Jian with a serious expression and bluntly said that he still had not reached a level where he could confront the Lich. When Ars said that Kim Jian's only task would be to absorb the Lich's corpse after it was defeated, he could only widen his eyes in shock. After that, Kim Jian scratched his head and said he understood, while Ars added that it was all for Kim Jian's safety, so he should not overthink it. With that said, Ars braced a hand on his knee, stood up, and said they would reach the place in just a few more days, so everyone should rest and conserve their strength. The corner of Kim Jian's mouth lifted slightly, and he replied with a small smile that he understood. The three of them stood up together and continued their journey forward. That night, Kim Jian kept training by hunting down the pack of dried corpses. Afterward, the whole group gathered around the campfire, laughing and chatting together in high spirits. By morning, Kim Jan was once again following airs and practicing staff swings like usual. When night fell, he sat beside the fire in silence, keeping watch over the two who were fast asleep. Chloe slung a bag over her shoulder, then dropped down heavily to rest and catch her breath. She let out a long sigh and complained that she was completely worn out. Eris turned back to look at Yu, then encouraged him, saying they only needed to push a little farther. He looked straight at the girl and said the entrance to the tomb was all the way at the end of that canyon. Jin Jian immediately stepped forward too, telling her to hand over the backpack so he could carry it. As soon as he said that, the main character hoisted the backpack onto his own shoulder. Then the young man glanced over, gave a faint smile, and urged Chloe to keep moving. Her eyes lit up at once, and she lifted her head with a quick, simple yeah. In front of the three of them stood a sheer cliff face, so steep and dangerous it was hard to breathe. Chloe looked up high above and hesitantly asked what this place was. Eris followed the direction of her gaze, then confirmed that she was right. His face suddenly turned serious, and his eyes locked straight ahead. His voice rang out with certainty. This place was the Lich's tomb. Without hesitation, the three of them descended one after another down the steps leading deep into the tomb. The inside of the tomb was terrifyingly vast yet completely empty, without a single thing in sight. He swept his gaze around, then remarked that the interior was far cleaner than he had expected. Chloe meanwhile frowned as a sudden sense of unease rose in her chest. Eris lifted the oil lamp to light the way ahead and warned the group to stay sharp. In a monster and undead-infested place like this, nothing jumping out would be surprising. Hearing that, the young man blinked and asked back if Eris seriously thought a ghost was going to pop out. But in the very next second, he froze and narrowed his eyes as if he had just realized something. The main character instantly whipped around and stammered that this was exactly the kind of classic line people say right before one appears behind them. And right then, behind him was a skeletal spirit raising a hand to scratch its head, casually greeting him as if it had already caught its prey. His expression changed completely, and he let out a panicked scream. Before that thing could even react, the young man swung his staff straight into its body with a brutally powerful strike. Watching the dry spirit collapse to the ground, he could only gasp and complain that it had scared the life out of him. Chloe ran over and asked how he could hit a ghost with a stick. Hearing that, the main character reassured her that what mattered was having the will and determination to land the hit. Nearby, a crawling rat suddenly jerked its head up when it heard the noise. Completely unaware that something was tailing him, he casually asked Eris what kind of being that lich really was. Eris raised the lamp higher, then fell silent for a brief moment. After a while, he finally said in a low voice that the lich was the ruler of this land of death. As Eris strode forward, he added that the creature could revive and command countless undead throughout the tomb. He looked straight at the purple glowing skeleton and said that if the lich regained its full strength, it would lead an army of undead and destroy the entire world. That was exactly why they had to kill it before it fully awakened. The moment he finished speaking, Eris swung his sword and cleanly severed the mummy's head in two. Unexpectedly, he frowned and looked at the young man before adding that even if they managed to kill the lich, its magic would still bring it back 100 years later. Eris stared at the main character and declared that at that very moment, he had seen the young man's special ability. His gaze settled on the dried remains scattered on the ground. If he could absorb and erase these undead creatures, then there was a very real chance he could do the same to the being that had created them. Hearing that, the young man was instantly stunned in shock. As he walked forward, he exclaimed that so that was it, and it honestly did not sound all that difficult. But then he asked whether the staff would really work the way the group had planned. Eris and Chloe watched his back, because no matter what, that staff could not absorb every monster. As soon as the main character stepped onto a floor tile, he admitted that he still did not truly understand how this item actually worked. Arz's face changed at once when he heard him continue. But everything should be fine, right? From behind, Chloe cried out in panic, telling Jin Jian to stop immediately. Hearing her call, he turned his head back in confusion. The young man immediately turned around and asked what was wrong and whether something had happened. Eris roared urgently, telling Jin Jian to get away from that spot right now. In the next instant, he jolted in shock when he realized he was standing in the middle of a magic circle. Seeing the light engulfing him, the main character blurted out in panic, "What the hell is happening?" In the blink of an eye, his body was swallowed by the light and vanished without a trace. Eris rushed forward with Chloe in tow, but by then the magic circle had already completely disappeared. Both he and the girl had gone pale, anxiously looking around everywhere. In the end, Eris could only stand frozen before the utterly empty corridor in front of him. Refusing to stay still, he immediately burst forward at full speed, hoping he had not already arrived too late. Elsewhere, the main character lay motionless at the bottom of a huge pit. He clutched his head and groaned, unable to understand what that bizarre beam of light had been. He looked around in every direction, dazed as he wondered where he was. Suddenly, he stopped short and fixed his stare in one direction. In front of the main character stood a gigantic door, and above it was mounted a sinister skull emblem. He lifted his head and stared at it, muttering that there was only one door. The young man kept his eyes on the door without blinking and thought to himself that anyone could guess the lich was definitely right behind it. He tightened his grip on the backpack strap and told himself that, at the very least, whatever waited ahead was not some trap that would chop off his arms and legs. On the other side, Ares and Chloe were still standing stiffly in the empty corridor, both of them too stunned to move. At that moment, the only thing left on the floor was a single fragment of bone. Ares shot forward and crushed that bone fragment beneath his foot. His face was full of worry as he held Chloe with one arm and rushed ahead at top speed. Being dragged along, she frowned and kept demanding to know what the hell had happened to Jin Jian. Ares's face darkened, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his brows tightly furrowed as he blamed himself. Damn it, he had been careless, because in this deadly otherworld, things like that could happen at any moment. Meanwhile, the main character put his hands on his hips, let out a breath, and told himself to stay calm and wait for Uncle Ares to arrive. Over here, Ares swung his sword and sliced through a mummy's head in a single strike. He quickly tore through the corridor, leaving the slain undead behind him. Chloe frowned and loudly demanded to know what was really going on, but Ares kept his grave expression and did not answer. The scene from moments ago replayed in his mind, and he explained that what Jin Jian had stepped on was the lich's teleportation magic circle. Hearing that, the girl immediately asked in alarm where he had been sent. Ares narrowed his eyes and answered that if his guess was correct, it was the chamber where the lich was hiding. In that other place, Jin Jian flinched and stared fearfully toward the opposite side. On its throne, the lich sat motionless like a statue. Its eyes were pitch black, and its entire body remained in the exact same pose without moving at all. Seeing that, he bit his lip and silently observed the monster in front of him. After a while, when it still did not move, the main character finally let out a soft sigh of relief. So that is the lich. Is it sleeping? Thank goodness. As long as I do not wake it up, things might still be okay. The moment Jin Jian turned to the side, a terrible premonition crashed over him. And just as he feared, this place was definitely not outside the door. The protagonist swept his gaze around, then froze when he realized he was actually inside the door. He did not dare move, only stood there scanning the area, afraid he might trigger another trap from this otherworldly space. Suddenly, the young man was horrified to see a blue phantom slip out from the staff. Jin Jian immediately grabbed it, his thoughts in total chaos. He could not understand why this was happening, when nothing like this had ever occurred before. On the opposite side, Matlich erupted with a dazzling violet light. The protagonist clearly felt danger crashing down from behind him, and his whole body locked in place. The eerie violet glow behind him grew brighter and brighter, as if it wanted to swallow his entire field of vision. The hand resting on the lich's thigh twitched slightly. Violent purple magic power burst out from his body. Jin Jian immediately backed away, staring tensely at the lich. In his hand, a scepter slowly began to take shape. The protagonist watched the lich spring to his feet, clutch the scepter tight, and look down from above. All he could do was despair, convinced this time he was definitely dead. Outside, Ares was rushing forward at full speed with Chloe in his arms when he heard a violent crash. The little girl looked over anxiously and asked what that sound was. Ares glanced in that direction, and his expression changed at once. It was over. Had that thing already awakened? At the same time, Jin Jian collapsed to the ground, his face drained white with fear. This thing. He trembled as he stared at the lich's figure floating in midair. This was clearly a completely different level of power. The lich raised one finger, condensing a sphere of energy aimed straight at the protagonist. He lifted his head, and the instant he saw it, his eyes flew wide open. Jin Jian stared at the massive stream of energy forming directly above his head. He sprang to his feet and gripped the staff tightly in his hand. He knew perfectly well there was no way he could dodge this attack. In the end, the protagonist clenched his teeth until blood seeped out. If that was the case, then his eyes flashed, and his teeth ground together as if he had reached a life-or-death resolve. He was going to block it. The moment Jin Jian swung up the staff, blue light burst from the weapon and stopped that attack in its tracks. He was stunned, but he still strained with all his might, gritting his teeth as he screamed in agony. Blue energy exploded from the staff, forcefully driving back the lich's magic. The lich was engulfed in violet magical light, and the entire scene reflected in the protagonist's eyes. A violent explosion erupted and swallowed the lich's whole body. Jin Jian still gripped the staff with both hands, holding his defensive stance as he stared straight ahead. His eyes narrowed, wary to the extreme. The dust slowly cleared, revealing a halo of violet magic power floating in the air behind it. Right after that, the lich's figure emerged once more from the thick smoke. Looking down at the protagonist from above, he let out a scornful laugh. Wrapped inside a sphere of magical power, the lich looked at him and coldly praised him, saying he possessed truly unusual strength. He gritted his teeth in guarded tension as he heard the lich mutter, "So its power core lies in the heart." The lich raised one finger and gave a slight beckoning motion. Jin Jian was instantly startled when he saw giant vines shoot up from the ground. They rushed at him with terrifying speed and coiled tightly around his wrists. Another vine immediately wrapped itself around one of the protagonist's legs. In the blink of an eye, all his limbs were bound fast. He was lifted high into the air. The Lich's eyes flashed again with a sinister violet gleam. Jin Jian bit down hard as he heard the Lich's voice sound right beside his ear. Got you. Looking down from above, the Lich continued in a contemptuous tone. Now then, he pointed a hand at the protagonist in front of him and growled, I will personally tear your flesh apart and see for myself. The Lich stretched out his hand toward him and called coldly, come here. Jin Jian's eyes bulged wide when he heard the Lich continue talking about tearing him to pieces. Right then, a streak of black aura shot in and slashed straight at the Lich's wrist. Both he and the Lich turned their heads at the same time to look over. In the reflected glow, Ars's figure slowly stepped in with a sword in hand. He stood tall with his sword in hand, facing the enemy head-on. Ars swept a cold, razor-sharp gaze across the battlefield. The vines binding the protagonist were instantly cut apart. His whole body slammed hard onto the ground right after that. Jin Jian doubled over and let out a pained groan. Ars looked toward Jin Jian and asked if he was hurt anywhere. Right after that, he turned his head and told him to fall back at once. Ars fixed his eyes on the Lich and said to leave the rest to him. The Lich immediately raised one finger and pointed at Ars, sending countless streams of magic power shooting straight at him. Ars remained standing where he was, calmly facing the incoming barrage of magical arrows. Then in the very next instant, all of them exploded one after another. Jin Jian lowered his head toward that blinding chain of explosions and cried out in panic. Uncle Ars! The Lich merely glanced over calmly, without the slightest reaction. But from within the cloud of smoke and dust, the tip of a sword suddenly flashed out. Ars charged in and unleashed an immensely powerful horizontal slash. His sword aura tore through the wind and cut straight through the Lich's body. Ars tightened his grip on the sword and tilted his eyes to the side, carefully observing. But right after that, the Lich's body quickly gathered back together and began to regenerate. In only a brief moment, he had fully restored himself and then spoke. Looks like the two of us are both the brutally villainous type. Ars narrowed his eyes and stared at the Lich with full concentration. The Lich raised both hands, preparing to condense his magic power. From his palms, violet light blazed brilliantly once again. The Lich swung his arm hard and hurled the magical sphere straight into the sky. Jin Jian lifted his head to follow it, then shouted in alarm, what the hell is this? The Lich's eyes flashed violet as he roared, this is the end for all of you. That blinding purple light instantly spread out and engulfed the entire area. Jin Jian stared wide-eyed, his mouth hanging open in shock at the scene unfolding before him. He used all his strength to tighten his grip on the staff in his hand. Purple death light erupted around the protagonist, crushing and ripping apart all the ground around him. Ars drove his sword hard into the ground to keep his body from being swept away. He furrowed his brows and focused his stare straight ahead. The Lich hovered in midair, and beneath him the ground had already been completely swallowed by magic. He silently looked down from above, observing everything below without saying a single word. Jin Jian lifted his head and looked up, hearing the Lich say coldly that usually only one person dared face it, yet this time he had brought along another bizarre existence. The Lich locked its gaze on him, then asked through gritted teeth whether this was the trump card they had prepared to destroy it. Right after that, it immediately pressed its hands together, but also stressed that the other side was not the only one who had come prepared. The Lich closed its eyes and quickly began chanting a sinister, whispering incantation of the void. Ars merely pressed his lips together and silently watched the other side, with deep caution in his eyes. The space around him began to distort, twisting as if it were being crushed apart by otherworldly magic. After the violent warping ended, only Ars and the Lich remained trapped inside that place. He immediately turned his head and anxiously searched for the young man's figure. Looking down from above, the Lich finally spoke, saying that this space had originally been prepared especially for him. Ars gritted his teeth and asked in a cold voice if it meant to drag him in here for a 1-1 duel. The Lich narrowed its eyes and calmly replied that would be fine, but first it wanted to open the gift his side had brought and take a look. On the other side, the protagonist looked around at the unfamiliar space and blurted out in agitation, what the hell kind of place was this? Staring fixedly at Ars, the Lich slowly said that he seemed to be carrying a dagger meant to stab into its heart, but that strike would ultimately turn back and harm him instead. He struggled to force his body to move, but all he could do was grit his teeth and curse inwardly because he could not move at all. Ars frowned and glanced behind him, realizing this was likely some kind of mental magic rather than reality itself. He raised his head toward the Lich and understood that escaping would not be easy, though normally he could have taken his time finding a way to break it. Ars pressed his lips tight and thought that if he hesitated any longer, the young man's life would be in danger, so he could only hope the boy could hold out a little longer. Elsewhere, he froze on the spot when he suddenly heard the Lich scream, offering a harsh command to present it. Its voice echoed through the entire space, ordering everything to be offered up to the ruler of death and the living terror of life. The protagonist looked up at the eerie phantom image of the lich manifesting before him. That voice kept repeating beside his ears, throwing him into panic, as if it wanted to force him to offer up everything he had. Streams of icy energy shot toward him all at once, aiming straight for his body and the power hidden inside him. But right in front of the lich, a massive phantom suddenly appeared, circling wildly before roaring that this vessel would belong to it. It opened its maw and lunged straight at the lich, furiously shouting how dare it trespass on its territory without the slightest fear. The lich's eyes widened in shock, and it could not stop itself from shouting, "What the hell is going on here?" Meanwhile, Ares remained rooted in place, pouring all his strength into finding a way to break free from the magical shackles. Suddenly, he paused, astonished when he sensed the violent change in the surrounding mana. Ares went still when he heard the lich cry out in a broken voice, managing only a single panic-stricken word. The lich's body was being devoured little by that phantom, while it screamed and demanded to know what in the world Ares had brought here. Seeing the flash of light in its eye, he instantly understood that the moment to strike back had finally arrived. In the next instant, Ares gathered his mana and swung his sword upward with all his might. The lich was horrified as his sword aura split it in two in the blink of an eye. It looked at its own body being ceaselessly corroded by the phantom, then trembled as it forced out the words, "This is..." The lich's entire body was gradually devoured clean, and all that remained was its unwilling scream that this was impossible. In the end, the lich's body slowly dissolved into the air as though it had never existed at all. At that very moment, Ares suddenly heard a ferocious roar explode right beside his ear. He instantly spun around and shouted the young man's name at the top of his lungs. At that moment, the young man frowned in discomfort and vaguely asked what exactly had happened. The staff beside him suddenly flashed with a dazzling blue light. Right after that, the lich's remaining deep violet mana rapidly spilled out all around the protagonist. That stream of mana immediately shot straight toward him as he sat on the ground. Ares turned back to look and realized that it was the lingering mana left behind by the lich. Those sinister currents of energy quickly surrounded Jinjian from every direction. His whole body suddenly stiffened, freezing in place as if it had been locked down. As more and more mana invaded him, he collapsed to the ground and screamed in agony, making Ares cry out in alarm. The surging mana swirled around his body as if it meant to force every last bit of itself into fusion within him. Seeing that, Ares became deeply anxious because it was an enormous source of mana, and if the boy absorbed it, the consequences would be unimaginable. When the mana finally began to fade, only the young man remained, lying face down and motionless on the ground. He hurried over to his side and kept calling for him to wake up. Looking at him with open worry, Ares wondered if this was a side effect from absorbing the lich. All of a sudden, a voice sounded from behind him and made him jolt at once. "Lord Ares." Ares went still, not moving even the slightest bit for a moment. Only after a few seconds did he slowly turn his head toward the source of the voice. Equinestalis, wearing high heels, walked toward them with calm, measured steps. Amid the chaos, another voice rang out inside the protagonist's head, urgently telling him that he had to find ear. Hearing that, he jolted and opened his eyes so wide it was as if he could not believe it. Jinjian sprang up in panic and let out a sharp, startled cry. He froze, his eyes darting around again and again, because the space before him was far too unfamiliar. The protagonist stood there in a daze for about 3 seconds, as if his brain still had not caught up with reality. He shook his head hard and muttered about Uncle Ares and Chloe, his mind in total turmoil as he could not understand where everyone had disappeared. A moment later, he noticed a bag and a sheet of paper lying right in front of him. He picked it up and saw a message saying that because something extremely urgent had come up, they had to leave first, and that the lich monster had been defeated thanks to him. Even after seeing Ars's name at the end, Jinjian was still baffled, because he had clearly never seen these characters before, yet he could somehow read every word. He sat there blankly, wondering if the most important issue right now was whether he had really been abandoned. Rewinding to a few minutes earlier, Ars narrowed his eyes and looked into the distance with a contemplative expression. He observed the woman standing before him, then asked what exactly had brought her here. The long-haired woman in seductive clothing had just walked closer when Ars called out Equinestalis' name without mistake. That beautiful face was obviously not unfamiliar to him in the slightest. Equinestalis walked slowly forward and relayed the order that His Majesty the Emperor was summoning him immediately. Ars instantly drew his weapon and demanded in a low voice why the summons had come so suddenly. She curled her lips into a mocking smile and asked how long it had been, yet he still acted so surprised. Equinestalis stepped even closer and sneered that since when had His Majesty ever needed to ask for his opinion or wait for his consent. After hearing that, Ars immediately grew stern and fell into heavy contemplation. She raised spirit power into her palm and continued that he would understand every detail once he returned to the imperial palace. In the blink of an eye, Aquanasthalis created a blazing red magic circle and calmly concluded that it seemed his work here was already finished. Just then, a shout calling for Uncle Ayres rang out, drawing both of their attention at once. Chloe pressed a hand to her chest and anxiously asked whether Jinjian was okay, and what had happened to that lich now. But right after that, the little girl suddenly stopped short, and her face instantly turned extremely tense. Chloe saw Aquanasthalis smiling as she lightly flicked her hand, and a strange sense of familiarity rose in her heart as she blurted out, "You are..." Right after that, Kim Jian's body was laid down at Ayres' feet, making the little girl beside him stare at him in shock. Chloe immediately rushed over and frantically shook the main character, begging him to wake up. Just then, a voice rang out, making the little girl freeze before she looked up. "Calm down, Chloe." He dropped to one knee to examine him, then concluded in a low voice that the boy had only passed out from the shock of absorbing the lich entity, and that his life was not in danger at all. On the other side, Aquanasthalis merely stood there with her arms folded, watching with a faint smile. All of a sudden, Ayres' brows drew tightly together. He stared intently at the young man's body and thought to himself that, even though there was still so much he could not understand, something about this was clear. Ayres immediately called out to Chloe. He told her to prepare some food and a map, pack everything into a small bag, and leave it for him. Chloe was surprised, but she still nodded and said she understood. Meanwhile, Aquanasthalis remained where she was, silently waiting for them to finish. She narrowed her eyes slightly, and suspicion was written all over her face. Aquanasthalis fixed her gaze on his face and quietly wondered whether he had really absorbed a lich. She gently raised a hand to cover her mouth, and her eyes flashed with amusement. A sly smile slowly formed on Aquanasthalis's lips. She secretly thought that she had just overheard something extremely interesting. At that moment, Ayres spoke up and told everyone it was time to leave, startling her, and making her silently scold herself for being so absent-minded. Before leaving, he carefully placed the bag and a note beside the young man. After that, Ayres and Chloe headed toward the open gate together. He suddenly stopped right in front of Aquanasthalis. Ayres bowed his head slightly and lowered his voice, whispering that he had a warning for her. Killing intent poured off him without restraint. "You'd better keep your distance and stay away from that boy." Even after hearing that spine-chilling threat, she calmly replied as if she were not shaken in the slightest, as long as he still wanted to keep living. After saying that, Ayres stepped straight through the door, while Chloe kept looking back at the main character with eyes full of reluctance. Right after that, Aquanasthalis also turned to look at him. He was still fast asleep, completely unaware of everything that had just happened. Then Aquanasthalis turned around, curled her lips into a faint smirk, and muttered that she would remember this well. In the blink of an eye, the door created by her spiritual power slowly faded away as well. Back in reality, he stood there in his new clothes, looking dejected as he complained that they were seriously too heartless. The main character's eyes grew misty as he sadly thought that, even though they had not been together for long, he had believed the whole group had become as close as family. He suddenly snapped his head up and shouted, "So you guys just left me behind? Was I really the only one who meant any of it from start to finish?" The only response to his miserable outburst was a vast empty silence, and that left him standing there awkwardly. He scratched his head and tried to reassure himself that they must have had no other choice, which was why they had done it. The young man picked up the note again and read it, his head full of questions. Ayres had even written that the lich was defeated because of him, but what he actually done? He looked down at his own hand and grew even more confused, because he did not feel any stronger at all, so he figured he must not have truly absorbed it. Kim Jian stood frozen in place for several more seconds, as if he still could not process everything that had happened. Then he suddenly broke into a calculating smile. If that was the case, why not try using something else instead? Kim Jian jumped up in excitement and cheered that, if he had just killed a giant bug, then there was no way it had not dropped some awesome gear. Right after that, an item really did appear in his hand. Hero rank, Cursed Elf Skull Orb. Next came a legendary rank item, Staff of Agony and Despair. The main character went completely speechless at the pile of loot that dropped out. Unique rank, Demon Sword of Savage Screams. Legendary rank, Bloodstained Ritual Dagger. Hero rank, Dread Phantom Warhammer. In the end, all he could do was groan, because every item looked like it would curse him the second he touched it. Looking outside, a map and a compass had already been prepared. He picked them up and asked blankly, "Is it really just a map and a compass?" He scratched his head and groaned to the heavens. For someone who had only ever relied on phone map apps, this stuff was way too hard. Kim Jian frowned and tried to reason things out based on the symbols on the map. If he crossed the western forest, he would probably reach a village. He estimated the distance with his eyes and let out a weary sigh. That is ridiculously far. In the end, I still have to trudge along all by myself. Not long after that, a human skeleton suddenly took a direct hit. Kim Jian held a stick in his hand and quietly watched it dissolve right in front of his eyes. So, for the entire 3 months since he had parted ways with Er's group, he had been traveling alone across this brutal wilderness. Thanks to the valuable knowledge he had learned from Ers and Chloe, the main character had managed to make it this far without too much trouble, even though the journey had been painfully lonely. Then Kim Ji-yeon's eyes suddenly widened so much that he could hardly believe what he was seeing. At long last, he had finally escaped that deadly land of ruin. Fresh grass and lush green trees spread out before his eyes. It had been nearly a year since he had last seen a scene so full of life. He took several deep breaths, savoring the pleasant scent, and marveled to himself, I can finally see a peaceful, beautiful place, with no monsters and no sandstorms. But at that exact moment, a violent explosion suddenly erupted not far away. Kim Ji-yeon turned his head in a daze, his face practically saying that peace really had not lasted long at all. The scene shifts to an area deep in the forest where a small blue pool sat in the middle of the trees. Someone's panicked footsteps came running in and stomped hard straight into that pool, and ran for his life through the forest in sheer terror. He was drenched in sweat and gritted his teeth, cursing under his breath a few times, because the situation was so hopeless, and did not notice the shadow closing in behind him at all, because the only thing left in his mind was the question of how things had turned out like this. Just 1 second later, the creature slammed down on the spot where he had been standing and sent and flying to the side. Driven by the impact, En's whole body crashed hard onto the ground, while the savage beast let out a ferocious roar. En was overwhelmed with panic and kept asking himself why something that horrifying had appeared in a place like this. The gigantic dragon, overflowing with murderous intent, immediately advanced on him, and backed away in terror, screaming inside his head, why is there a dragon here? He narrowed his eyes, and his whole body went rigid as he realized that resisting now would be useless, and remembered Robert collapsed against the base of a tree and despaired, thinking that even Robert, the best martial artist in their group, had been killed before he could so much as touch it. What could a weak bronze rank hunter like him possibly do, when their group had only come here to clear out a few small goblins? Meanwhile, the dragon kept closing in, step by step drawing nearer and nearer. In the end, it could not hold back any longer and opened its massive jaws wide, as if it meant to swallow its prey whole, and squeezed his eyes shut and thought in despair that everything was over. At the most dangerous moment, Eniosa rushed in and struck the dragon with a powerful blow. Only then did En crack his eyes open, still unable to believe that he was alive. She stood there coldly glancing at the monster, and there was not even the slightest trace of fear in her eyes. From behind her, he shouted Eniosa's name. Hearing that, she turned her head and urgently yelled, "What are you standing there for? Get up and run." And staggered to obey, but he still wondered why she had come back. Had he not said that he would stay behind as bait so everyone else could escape? Eniosa tightened her grip on the weapon in her hand and declared with fierce spirit, "Did you really think I'd let you hog all the hero glory by yourself?" And could not help being moved, and he softly called Eniosa's name. Right after that, he pressed his lips together, forced himself to calm down, and muttered, "All right then," and quickly moved behind her so they could work together. He tightened his grip on his weapon's handle, and asked whether she was sure she actually had some kind of plan. Eniosa bared her teeth in a bitter grin and replied that if she really had a plan, Robert would not have died so unfairly like this, and stared straight at the dragon and warned the whole group that when she counted to 3, they had to run as fast as they could and never look back. She even stressed that all they had to do was follow her instructions exactly. The instant Eniosa shouted, the dragon's tail was already sweeping right toward her. With one terrifying smash, she was sent flying right in front of the main guy's eyes. The young man froze on the spot, his eyes wide in pure shock. When he saw Eniosa lying deep inside a crater, he frantically called out her name. At that exact moment, 2 arrows tore through the air from behind and shot past him. They were aimed straight at the dragon's head, making him panic and scream that they must not do that. The main guy went pale as death, glanced behind him, and instantly realized that if even she had come this far, then the situation had already become disastrous. Then he Sarah's trembling all over, her hand still clenched tightly around her bow. Tears shimmered in the girl's eyes as she apologized in a shaking voice, saying she could not bear to abandon everyone and run away by herself. He immediately shouted in alarm and ordered her to leave this place at once. But before his words had even finished, the dragon stomped hard and launched itself into the air. Ceres went rigid where she stood, lifting her face in despair as she begged for anyone, to appear. The monster opened its mouth wide and stretched its grotesquely long tongue toward her, while Ceres could only stand there waiting for a miracle to save the whole group. Her pupils shrank violently and tears streamed down her face. In that very instant, Jin Jian came charging out of nowhere and slammed his staff straight down onto the dragon's skull. The sight left both Ceres and the main guy completely stunned in disbelief. After that strike, he stared seriously at the glowing staff in his hand. Not long after, the two of them bent forward at a full 90 degrees and loudly thanked him for saving their lives. By then, the dragon's corpse was already lying motionless right behind them. Jinjian scratched his head and kept waving his hands, modestly saying that he had not really done anything that impressive. The main guy suddenly grabbed his hand and immediately argued back, telling him not to be so humble. His eyes shone like stars as he excitedly yelled that Jinjian truly was the savior of his life. He turned to look at Aniosa lying there and rattled on, saying that without one strike, their whole party would have died already, and luckily she was still breathing. After that, he stole a glance at the dragon's corpse and hesitantly admitted that killing it with a single blow was genuinely beyond imagination. The main guy noticed the dragon's skull had caved in deeply and blood was still pouring out, which made him start guessing at Jinjian's true identity. In the end, he boldly asked whether Jinjian might be a high-rank hunter. Jinjian pressed his lips together, unsure how to answer, while the young man kept wildly guessing. Gold rank, silver rank, or maybe even platinum. After saying that, both Thierry's and the main guy fell completely silent as they waited for his answer. But Jinjian answered in a way that felt like a bucket of cold water to the face, asking back what those things even were. The two of them instantly froze, utterly confused. As for him, all he could do was force an awkward laugh, his head full of question marks. A while later, the main guy carried Aniosa on his back and gradually began piecing something together. As he looked back at Jinjian, he cautiously asked whether he truly came from another world. Jinjian scratched his cheek and admitted that he knew it sounded hard to believe, but the young man immediately said with certainty that he believed the benefactor who had saved their lives would never lie. Walking behind them with a pile of weapons in her arms, Carries wondered that if teleportation magic still existed, then crossing between dimensions was not impossible either. The main guy nodded in agreement and said that even they still did not fully understand this other world. Meanwhile, Jinjian offered to help carry some of her things, but Ceres hugged the weapons tighter and refused because she did not dare let their savior do that. He could only sigh helplessly, thinking to himself that a transmigration case like his had to be incredibly rare here. Suddenly, the young man looked back and brought up what had happened earlier, saying he was still seriously shaken. The main guy recalled that strange stream of blue spiritual power and said that a bizarre monster had appeared and then devoured the dragon's corpse. He also could not forget the image of the staff transforming into an iron mace, radiating a terrifying magical force that was almost impossible to believe. His eyes lit up with curiosity as he asked whether everyone in Jinjian's world possessed special powers like that. Even Ceres, walking behind them, showed no less admiration on her face. Jinjian turned his face aside and gave a vague answer, saying that was probably the case. Hearing that, the main guy instantly got excited as if he had found the answer, while Jinjian thought it was better to let them misunderstand than sit there explaining the system and everything else. All of a sudden, the young man stopped walking and guessed that maybe they had finally arrived. The main guy stared ahead and was stunned to recognize the place. Before them lay the territory at the far eastern edge of the mysterious kingdom of Romania, a city called Superchuk. Jinjian unconsciously pressed his lips together, his eyes turning misty. Finding that strange, the young man quickly asked if something was wrong, or if this place was completely different from what he had imagined. He raised a hand to wipe away his tears and hurriedly denied it, saying it was nothing like that at all. Jinjian hesitated, lowered his hand, and only quietly said that he was just looking at the bustling stream of people passing by. He blurted out emotionally that it had been far too long since he had seen such a lively scene. Not long after, Jinjian began wolfing down the red meat on the table. Then he lifted his mug of beer and chugged it down in one satisfying gulp. Slamming the beer mug back onto the table, Jinjian looked completely satisfied. With his cheeks slightly flushed, he looked at the spread of food and thought that he had never expected the first real beer of his adult life would be in a strange world. He had sneaked a few sips before, but the taste here was clearly on a whole different level. Resting his hand against his face, he vaguely remembered that the other two were named Anne and Carries, and they had said they would go check on their other companions before coming right back. Before leaving, the main guy had also said that they would treat Aniosa's injuries and lay Robert's body to rest. Hearing that, Jinjian could only offer his condolences and confirm that their party had just lost a teammate. After hearing it, the young man merely let out a quiet sigh after that and gave him a money pouch and said that although it was not much, he should stay for now at a nearby inn, and they would return to see him soon. Jinjian accepted it and sincerely thanked her. Back in the present, he glanced at the money pouch and thought that after he got some rest, they would probably come back. He nodded to himself a few times, but then realized that something else was more important right now. Jinjian swept his gaze around the beer hall and became even more certain that he really had wandered into another world. All around him, everyone was happily soaking in the lively atmosphere, while the staff kept pouring beer without pause. Propping up his chin as he thought, he wondered where he should start, then decided that he might as well get some sleep first. Time passed quietly, and the morning sunlight gradually spread across the entire room. Only then did he groggily sit up after a long sleep. Jin Jian sat dazed in the room for a long while. Then he raised a hand to wipe away his drool and marveled at how long it had been since he had slept on such a proper bed, so comfortably that he had lost track of time. Suddenly the sound of knocking came from outside the door. Yawning again and again, Jin Jian cracked the door open and asked who was outside. Standing at the door was Aniosa, her body still wrapped in bandages, and beside her Ceres asked whether he had slept well, while Aniosa looked openly irritated. Meanwhile, Ceres smiled at him with clear anticipation in her eyes. Jin Jian was fairly surprised, so he simply stared at her. Not long after, the three of them headed downstairs together. The moment the main guy saw them, he jumped to his feet and waved, loudly calling for Jin Jian to come over here. He greeted him with a bright and friendly smile. Before long, a table full of steaming hot dishes was spread out in front of them. The moment Kim Jian sat down and spoke up and said Aniosa had insisted on meeting him in person no matter what, just to thank him properly. She raised her mug of beer, her face flushed bright red, and hurriedly denied ever making it sound that dramatic. Kim Jian lightly raised a hand and picked up the conversation, saying that everything had been too chaotic yesterday, so she still had not gotten a proper chance to talk with him. The young man scooped up a spoonful of food and told them not to be so formal, since thanks to their whole group, he had actually been able to rest peacefully last night, and placed a hand over her chest and formally introduced herself again, saying her name was Anne, a bronze-ranked hunter from a party called the Righteous Wayfarers. He then turned and introduced Aniosa as a teammate from the same party, while she quietly offered her thanks for everything he had done, and continued by pointing to the last person and said this was Ceres, the only support specialist in their party. The young man looked a little puzzled, so he asked directly what hunters and rank badges in this other world actually meant. Aniosa immediately leaned forward and blurted out her shock, as if she could not believe what she had just heard. Seeing that expression, Kim Jian could only go speechless, like he had just asked something as absurdly basic as what 1 + 1 equaled. He vaguely remembered Era's mentioning silver rank and gold rank before, and laughed awkwardly in response and apologized, saying that he probably still did not fully understand this world yet. He quickly explained that hunters were people who specialized in hunting monsters, wild beasts, or taking on all kinds of commissions. But none of that was considered legitimate unless they were official members of the Hunters Association. Normally, hunters formed parties of at least 2, though the most common setup was 4, and added that badges were the ranking system the association used to evaluate each individual hunter. In ascending order, the ranks were steel, bronze, silver, gold, and platinum, and above them all was Midran, the highest rank. Even if some parties had members from several different ranks, their missions were still limited by the lowest ranked member. Because of that, most hunters preferred teaming up with people at their own level to make commissions and promotions easier. He further revealed that steel and bronze ranks mostly hunted woodland beasts or scattered low-level monsters. On top of that, they had to take all kinds of odd jobs just to make a living, and went on to say that those with silver badges were already seasoned hunters, the kind who dealt with true monsters. Most people retired before they ever reached that level. He kept talking without pause, saying gold rank was the elite of the association. Even a major branch would only have around 3 or 4 such parties. From that level onward, they usually led silver teams instead of gathering into all gold parties of their own, and continued saying that as for platinum rank, even he did not know much. He had only heard rumors that the entire association did not even have 20 of them, and in his whole life, he had never seen one with his own eyes. He emphasized that the final rank was pure silver star Midran. According to legend, only 10 such badges had ever appeared throughout the entire history of this continent, and continued saying that even now, only 3 hunters bearing Midran badges were still active. They were living legends in the truest sense. The young man ate in silence and thought it over, realizing that things in this fantasy world were far more serious than he had imagined. He then heard that badges were not just measures of strength, but also travel passes and symbols of prestige. That was why lost badges were hunted down for outrageous prices on the black market. Of course, impersonating a hunter was a grave crime, and anyone who wanted a promotion had to accept and complete countless association commissions, and opened his palm and said that his own party was currently only bronze rank. It was nothing glorious, but it was enough to get by. Kim Jian nodded and said he understood, but inside it felt like his head was about to explode from the sheer flood of information, and suddenly hesitated as if she wanted to seize the chance to bring up something else. Noticing that shift in attitude, the young man turned toward her with curiosity. He finally said it outright, hoping that Kim Jian might be willing to join their party. Kim Jian froze for a second, pointed at himself and asked, "Me?" He quickly waved his hands and explained that they were not trying to pressure him at all. It was just that he was still unfamiliar with this world, so he would definitely need money and an official identity. And as it happened, their party had exactly one position open. The young man slowly put another bite of food into his mouth and thought it through. They were not wrong. At the very least, until he found a way back, he had to adapt to this other world's society. If he wanted to survive, he needed money, information, and a place to belong. Right then, Aniosa suddenly jumped up and cut in excitedly, saying he was absurdly strong. From what Antares had told her, Kim Jian had killed a dragon in a single blow. If that were true, then going on missions would be completely safe. But immediately after that, a cold voice rang out and flatly declared it an outright lie. She stopped short, then turned around in confusion to look behind her. The person who had spoken slammed a hand down on the table and demanded to know how anyone could possibly kill a dragon in a single move. She arched a brow in mocking disbelief and sneered that if they were going to lie, they should at least come up with a story that sounded remotely believable. The young man's expression darkened as he wondered why another unfamiliar face had shown up at a moment like this. He answered in a cold voice, telling her to stop rudely pointing fingers and get out of his sight. The one causing trouble was named Mary Chatelaine. That arrogant noblewoman covered her mouth and let out a derisive laugh, asking since when beast folk were allowed to sit at the same table as humans. Fur was shedding all over the place, she said, so that animals should be thrown onto the floor to eat where it belonged. Insulted right to her face, Aniosa instantly blew up and shouted in rage, and had to hurry and hold her back, doing his best to calm her down. Right after that, Mary Chatelaine narrowed her eyes at him and asked if he was the one rumored to have killed that dragon. The young man merely glanced at her and calmly answered with a single word, yes. She crossed her arms and pressed further, asking whether he had brought back any spoils. A dragon's corpse should have been worth an enormous fortune. At that, and immediately faltered, because this was genuinely hard to explain. The moment she caught that weak point, Mary Chatelaine broke into a laugh dripping with ridicule. She braced a hand on the table, leaned close to his face, and declared that of course he had nothing, because the whole story had been a ridiculous fabrication from the very beginning. The young man finally lost patience and snapped that he had been trying to let it slide, but everything had its limits. Mary Chatelaine still defiantly challenged him, asking what if she simply felt like crossing that limit anyway. She gave off an aggressive aura and raised her voice in open provocation, telling him to try and see what exactly he could do to stop her. By now, the thread of his composure had been stretched to its absolute limit, and then it finally snapped. Kim Jian immediately released a killing intent, the corner of his mouth curling with disdain as he delivered a brutal line. This runt is really starting to get on my nerves. Mary Chatelaine exploded and screamed, runt. Who does some nameless nobody from a hole in the wall think he is to say that? He fired back at once. And who exactly were you calling a nobody? Just as both sides were about to erupt, someone suddenly stepped out in front of her and apologized. The young man frowned, having absolutely no idea who this new arrival was supposed to be. The man merely tilted his head and gave a very faint smile. Mary Chatelaine shot him an irritated look and barked, Brian, who gave you permission to butt into this conversation? Brian, a specialist from the noble class, turned to her and said he was deeply sorry, my lady, but in his opinion, they were disturbing others and should return to their seats. He took hold of her shoulder and tried to pull her away, telling her that was enough, and it was time to eat. From behind them, Kim Jian even called out again. Mary Chatelaine twisted violently and shouted for Brian to let go. She smacked Brian's hand off her shoulder and yelled that she was still talking. Who did he think he was, cutting in like that? In an instant, his entire demeanor changed. His eyes immediately turned dark and heavy. Brian turned his head back, his voice now razor cold, and said it would be best to end everything here. Seeing that pressure, the young man also paused for a brief moment. He let out a cold snort, his face full of irritation. With a dark expression, he bluntly said that both of them were seriously pissing him off right now. The atmosphere inside the dining hall instantly froze, stretched tight as a drawn bowstring. The young man and Brian stared each other down, neither willing to give even a single step. Just then, someone lightly tapped his leg and spoke in a mediating tone, asking why everyone had let the mood spiral this far. That person looked up and continued, saying even Brian had gone far enough. Then he turned and pointed out clearly that Mary Chatelaine had been the one in the wrong from the very beginning. Hearing that, Brian could only let out a tired sigh. He then faced Kim Jian and added that no matter what, they truly did owe him an apology. Erin, a dwarf from the nobility, put her hands on her hips and explained that the story of him slaying a dragon in one strike was indeed hard to believe right away. She guessed that was why Mary had acted so rudely, and she hoped he would forgive her. The only response to that apology was a long stretch of silence from Kim Jian. He lowered his head and thought. The smallest person here was somehow the most mature one of all, so fine, he would let it go. But then Erin turned and grumbled at Brian, asking why she had told him to stop things, only for him to jump into the argument too. Only then did he cast a glance behind him. Both and Antares were sitting there in complete silence, neither of them daring to cut in. The young man scratched his head and brushed it off, saying he did not want to make any more trouble either, so they should please take her away. Standing beside Brian, Aaron immediately raised a hand to thank him for being understanding. But when he looked over and saw Mary Chatelaine still glaring provocatively, his voice trembled with frustration as he urged Brian to take her away quickly before things truly spun out of control. After that, Kariz gave an awkward smile and praised Kim Ji-an for keeping his cool so well. She said Mary Chatelaine had a vicious mouth, but was not necessarily a bad person. He turned and sat back down, hesitating as if he were weighing something in his mind. Then Kim Ji-an's next words made both an Aniosa jolt in surprise. If I really want to become a hunter. He frowned and continued, then what is the very first step I need to take? And placed a badge in Kim Ji-an's palm, as if he were opening the very first door into the world of hunters. He raised one finger, flashed a bright smile, and told him that all he had to do now was pay the registration fee. The main character's mood instantly crashed, and only one thought remained in his head. In the end, it still all came back to money, and bluntly asked whether he had any money left, since what he had given him earlier was probably almost gone. He hesitated, then said his companions seemed to have given him a little before. The young man hurriedly opened the money pouch that Ayers and Chloe had prepared for him in advance. Kim Ji-an stared blankly and blurted out that there was only one coin inside. One look was enough for Ann to realize it was actually a gold coin. He quickly raised a hand and explained that one gold coin was worth 1,000 crowns, and every currency in this other world had a clearly defined exchange rate. The denominations, arranged from lowest to highest, were 1 crown, 10 crowns, 100 crowns, and 1,000 crowns. The main character's eyes lit up at once, and he quickly asked if that would be enough to cover it, and immediately assured him it was more than enough, since hunter registration only cost 500 crowns. The moment he heard that, his face darkened, and he silently groaned that just registering had already eaten up half a gold coin. The four of them fell silent for a moment, and the atmosphere suddenly turned stiff and awkward. After a while, Ann stood up and excused himself, saying that once his hunter registration was fully taken care of, they would be leaving first. Hearing that, he immediately asked with curiosity whether they were planning to leave right away, and turned back and reminded him that there was still a lot to arrange before the subjugation mission began. He should also take the chance to rest and prepare thoroughly, and told Kim Ji-an to come back to this exact spot in 3 days so they could meet again. The main character froze for a few beats, then muttered under his breath, 3 whole days. All he could do was give a wry smile and let out a quiet sigh, and added that the inn he was staying at was actually under the Hunter Association's management. He also explained that most of the people coming and going there were hunters, making it the perfect place for the main character to start making connections, and pointed to a notice on the bulletin board and said that if he had too much free time, he could try taking a few small requests to find some work before leaving, and also offered that if Kim Ji-an still had not found a party or a destination after 3 days, he could join their group. Whether he joined the team or not, they would still be taking part in that subjugation mission together. Kim Ji-an cheerfully replied that he would seriously consider the offer. Before heading out, Aniosa told him to stay here and not wander too far. Sari said goodbye as well, and he raised a hand in reply, telling them not to worry. Kim Ji-an let out a long breath and silently watched the whole group disappear from sight. Right after that, he muttered in exasperation that this really had been one unbelievably chaotic morning. He looked at the badge in his hand and clicked his tongue, realizing that this tiny little thing was somehow worth a full 500 crowns. While eating, the main character did the math in his head. Breakfast of bread and soup cost only 3 crowns per person. Adding yesterday's drinks, meat, and room fee together, the total had only come to 20 crowns. Only then did he realize in shock that a single gold coin was enough to cover food and lodging for 20 days. If that money were converted entirely into food, it would probably pile up like a mountain. The young man dropped his head onto the table and lamented how desperately he missed home. In this other world, was he really not even allowed one familiar pleasure? The dream life he had imagined seemed so close, yet more out of reach than ever. Kim Ji-an was almost moved to tears by his own fate. In no time at all, he had already been thrown back into scraping by coin, as if he had never known comfort in the first place. Suddenly, he paused when Ann's words came back to him. A subjugation mission, huh? Maybe it really was time for him to start preparing to step into the life of a true hunter. Not long after that, Kim Ji-an had changed into a full hunter's outfit. It came with matching pants, along with a staff neatly strapped across his back. The shopkeeper looked at him and beamed, saying, "My goodness, that outfit was practically made just for you, sir." She quoted him a total of 230 crowns, then sweetly corrected herself and called him a valued regular, leaving the main character speechless at how brutally hard she had judged him. As he left the shop, the seller even called after him, saying he should come back and support her business next time. He walked away telling himself it was a good thing he had been too stingy to even glance at the plate armor. Stepping out of the store, he fell into thought about what he should do next. Kim Ji-an swept his gaze over the crowds on the street and wondered where he was supposed to begin now. He rubbed his chin in hesitation. There was barely any money left in his pocket, so maybe he should try taking a request to earn a few more crowns. The scene shifted to the tavern, where Sin was wiping down a glass when she suddenly flinched in surprise. Kim Ji-yeon slapped a sheet of paper down hard on the table right in front of her. He even gave her a flashy wink before speaking up. I'd like to register to carry out a request. Sin refused at once. He had only registered today, so he did not qualify for those tasks yet. They required a bronze badge. At the moment, he could only do the jobs for steel badge rank over here. After hearing that, the main character could only stop short and say, I understand. And just like that, the first mission he had dreamed about turned out to be hauling sacks of flour. Next came cleaning out filthy, foul-smelling animal pens. After that, he even had to wash an enormous mountain of other people's dirty laundry. Kim Ji-yeon ground his teeth and cursed inwardly. This was what they called being a hunter. This was obviously nothing more than low-level errand work. Time passed just like that, and the sun gradually disappeared beyond the horizon. He dragged himself along the road, nearly drained of every last bit of strength. Kim Ji-yeon let out a weary sigh. He had spent the entire day doing brutal manual labor, with none of the level-up thrill or sense of achievement he had imagined from being an otherworldly hunter. Looking at the few coins in his hand, he bitterly realized that after all that suffering, his pay came to only 30 crowns. It was the kind of life where you worked for the day and lived for the day, spending almost everything you earned. The main character's face darkened. No matter what world he was in, life was still just as hard. Right at that moment, a middle-aged vendor's voice rang out ahead of him, calling, "Come enjoy something delicious before you head home." Skewers of piping hot meat, releasing an irresistible aroma, immediately caught his eye. Kim Ji-yeon swallowed hard and argued with himself in silence. One skewer should be fine, right? After all, I worked myself to the bone today. Thinking that, he immediately ordered one plate of mysterious meat skewers for 3 crowns. The moment he took his first bite, the main character's eyes went wide from how delicious it was. A dish from this strange world had completely conquered the taste buds of a modern man like him. The flavor was unbelievable, almost as if some kind of magical secret had been woven into the seasoning. While he was still fully absorbed in enjoying the food, someone suddenly approached. That person held up a compass, and a stream of blue spiritual energy immediately pointed straight at Kim Ji-yeon. The girl instantly stared at him without taking her eyes off him for even a second. As for Kim Ji-yeon, he casually kept ordering food, saying, "Give me one more skewer." Suddenly, someone from behind grabbed the hem of his clothes and said, "I finally found you." Kim Ji-yeon stopped chewing mid-bite and turned to look behind him. Standing before him was a beautiful young girl, so striking that it was hard to look away. She smiled, her cheeks flushed pink, then softly said, "This truly is the destiny of my life." A moment later, the main character folded his arms, half suspicious and half confused, then asked, "What exactly do you mean by that?" He repeated it to make sure. "You're saying I'm the destined hero you've been searching for?" The girl immediately nodded with complete seriousness. Kim Ji-yeon narrowed his eyes, still unable to believe it, and asked again, "And what are you basing that on?" Ariel quickly replied, "It comes from the prophecy my master left behind." She held up the compass and explained, "Whoever the needle points to is the savior who will rescue this world. My mission is to support that hero. That was the prophecy my master entrusted to me." He immediately shot back in doubt. A prophecy? How am I supposed to believe something that vague? Ariel remembered Dennis's back as she answered firmly, "I believe it completely. My master is Dennis, the legendary prophet witch." Kim Ji-yeon asked curiously, "Dennis?" Then he wondered if she was a mage, and whether she was really that famous. Ariel frowned and her voice turned sharp. "My master's prophecies have never been wrong, not even once." She began to explain that there had once been a time when Dennis complained that her shoulders were aching, and said it was about to rain. Ariel stressed that it had indeed rained that day. But the main character calmly replied, "I think that's just an old person feeling sore when the weather changes." Hearing that, the girl got angry, slammed her hand on the table, and shouted for him to take those words back immediately. Kim Ji-yeon jumped in surprise and gave in, saying, "Alright, I'm sorry. I take it back, okay?" He leaned forward and continued, "So if I really am this so-called destined hero, then what?" Ariel frowned and answered that her master had instructed her to assist the chosen one. No matter what he intended to do, her magic would surely become his support. Kim Ji-yeon crossed his arms and pressed her. "Then do you even know what I plan to do next?" She blurted out in surprise, "Aren't you going to save the world?" But he immediately denied it. "Absolutely not." Kim Ji-yeon spoke plainly. "My only goal is to find a way back to my original world." Ariel froze, then asked blankly, "Your original world?" He slowly stood up and brushed aside everything she had said before. "I don't care who you are, what your master is like, or what that hero title is supposed to mean." Kim Ji-yeon rejected it all without hesitation. "I have no intention of saving this world either, because I have far too many reasons to return home as soon as possible." He slid his hands into his pockets and turned away to leave. "So go find someone else." I don't know who you think you're looking for, but it definitely isn't me. Ariel went rigid at those words, as if every bit of faith inside her had just been dealt a crushing blow. At the same time, Mary Chatelaine, who was sitting upstairs, saw the two of them and could not help crying out in shock. Not long before that, Ariel had stood inside a magic circle with tears glistening in her eyes as she heard the instruction, "Take this magic item. It will lead you to your destiny." Her pupils widened to the limit, and only one fierce thought remained in her heart. Move forward, Ariel. The last thing she saw was Dennis's back, along with one final message: walk toward your destiny. Back in the present, the sacks had been lined up tightly side by side. Kim Jian was left panting heavily, sweat pouring down all over him. The old woman gave him a gentle smile and praised him. "Kim Jian, you really worked hard today." Kim Jian stood there watching the old woman pay him, and it left Ariel quietly puzzled. What exactly did this guy do every single day? Why was it that every time she saw him, he was throwing himself into back-breaking labor, like some hired hand? The kind old woman smiled and praised the main character for a job well done, then even gave him a little extra money. He bowed over and over in thanks. That sight only made her more curious. Was he really so broke that he did not even have a little money left to his name? Ariel bent down, her heart full of hesitation. Silently, she asked her master in her mind, was the man standing before her truly the destiny her master had once spoken of? She closed her eyes, her thoughts tangled into a hopeless mess. What should I do now? Right then, a voice suddenly rang out. "You followed me all the way here too." Ariel jolted and snapped her eyes wide open. While wiping away his sweat, the main character spoke bluntly. "You have been tailing me since this morning." He let out a sigh and tried to persuade her. "Enough already. Hurry back to your master, or to whoever is supposed to be by your side." The young man glanced away, then denied it. "I am not the legendary hero you are looking for." Ariel slowly began to speak. "My master." The moment he heard that, he froze when he learned that she had passed away long ago. He immediately lowered his head and apologized. "I am sorry. I did not mean to bring up something so painful." The girl stood up, then shifted to another subject. "You really want to return to your old world, do you not?" Ariel stepped in front of Kim Jian and declared firmly, "I will help you." The main character blanked out as every word sank into his ears. Whether it is finding a way home, or just cleaning up the chaos that is currently running wild, Ariel repeated herself, her gaze unwavering. "I will help you with everything I have." The scene shifted elsewhere. The air was tight with tension as the hunters prepared to set out. Someone was pulling up his armor to his knees, getting ready for the mission, and quietly adjusted all the gear on his body. Suddenly, someone called Anne's name, making him lift his head. Ceres walked in and reported that Kim Jian was nowhere to be seen. It looked like he was not in the lounge either, and asked back in surprise, "Really? That sounds way too strange." Just then, someone cut in and made them both stop short. Obviously, he already ran away. She smugly guessed that after bragging about killing a dragon in one blow with that flashy explosion spell, he must have been scared of being exposed and fled, and immediately recognized the speaker as Mary Chatelaine. He looked at her fully equipped outfit and asked, "What are you doing here?" Mary Chatelaine brushed a lock of hair aside and let out an amused sound. "So none of you have heard yet." She brought up the recent monster situation. There had been many reports showing that strange monsters, creatures not native to the Shinchak region, were appearing all over the area. Mary Chatelaine stood before her team with her arms crossed and boasted, "That is why our noble elite squad has personally accepted the mission to patrol the surrounding area." Anne and Ceres both went tense the moment they heard that. From patrols and reconnaissance to protecting undermanned rookie hunters, this mission was clearly anything but light, and immediately cut her off. "You can look down on me or on Ceres if you want, I can let that slide. But please stop insulting him." Veronica, the Bacon clan member from the noble elite group, curiously asked who Kim Jian was. Brian glanced over and replied that she had not been there at the time, so she had not seen him. "He is..." Ceres frowned and shouted as she cut him off. "That is right, Kim Jian is our life-saving benefactor. If you keep being this rude, we will not stay quiet." Mary Chatelaine raised a brow and sneered. "The last time I saw that precious benefactor of yours, he looked a lot more busy going on a date." Ceres froze for a few seconds, then asked blankly, "A date?" Mary nodded to confirm it. "Yes, with some elf girl. The two of them were even talking about fate and all that." Mary Chatelaine gave a mocking wink. "They were obviously too busy playing romance to remember any promise they made to you." Ceres instantly strode right up to Mary Chatelaine, her red pupils twitching with rage. "That is a complete lie." The killing intent coming off her made Mary turn pale. Ceres glared and warned her. "Kim Jian said he came from another world, and other than us he does not know anyone here. And now you are saying he found himself a lover after only 3 days. Even lies should have limits. My patience is not endless." Just as the atmosphere was about to explode, a voice rang out. "Exactly. Who said I was running away?" Mary Chatelain's eyes instantly brimmed with tears. Ceres slowly turned her head toward the source of the voice. Brian still wore the same calm expression as always, without the slightest sign of wavering. As for Anne, surprise flashed clearly across his face. The main character appeared with a faint smirk on his lips. Standing right behind him was Ariel. She tilted her head slightly, looking a little shy. He raised a hand to greet everyone. "Long time no see," and sprang to his feet, beaming brightly as he shouted, "Kim Jian." The joy on his face was impossible to hide. Kim Jian spoke up, making everyone turn at once. "I came like this, but I am still in time, right?" But contrary to what he expected, Mary Chatelaine only pointed at him with an irritated look. "You disgusting traitor." The moment they heard that, the two people beside him both stiffened. She angrily accused the main character. "We promised we would form a party together, so how could you secretly join someone else instead?" Mary Chatelaine leaned in close like she was putting him on trial. "You really are a shameless traitor." Hearing that, he grimaced and ground his teeth in annoyance. "Why are you butting into this?" Sitting off to the side, and looked a little awkward and explained, "This was completely voluntary. No one forced anything, so honestly it does not really concern us. Even so, I did not expect things to turn out like this." Ariel, on the other hand, looked extremely interested, a female mage from the elf race. "This is the first time I have ever seen an elf with my own eyes," she continued with friendly curiosity. "So what twist of fate brought the two of you together in the first place?" He scratched his head, looking uncomfortable, then tried to dodge the question. "If I explain that, it gets a little complicated." But unlike him, Ariel honestly told them everything right away. "I was the one who sought him out first." Even the way she said it carried a romantic fantasy novel vibe. "It was the thread of destiny that guided me to him." After hearing that, En's face flushed bright red, and he frantically asked again, "What did you just say?" Only Ceres remained seated, her whole body stiff as stone. At the other table, Brian sat with his arms crossed, silently observing. The main character sprang up from his seat and protested angrily. "Hey, do not use words that are so easy to misunderstand." But as he rubbed his nose in embarrassment, he could already sense this place was about to turn into the center some sumsy love drama, and calmed down again and asked, "So what is your name?" She quickly introduced herself as Ariel. Right after that, he eagerly held out his hand and asked with curiosity, "Miss Ariel, are you planning to join this subjugation mission too?" She closed her eyes and answered with total certainty, "Of course. I have no interest in anything except helping Kim Jian. That is why I went and got my hunter badge yesterday," and paused for a moment, then gave a short reply. "I understand." Brian took a sip of water, then glanced over and remarked, "Is this not exactly the image of a devoted wife and perfect daughter-in-law?" Veronica leaned closer and clicked her tongue in admiration too. "What pure affection." On this side, he informed everyone that Aniosa could not come because her injuries had not fully healed yet. In truth, having one more person join would make the whole team feel a lot more secure. Kim Jian crossed his arms and made an apologetic face as he admitted fault. "I am truly sorry. I should have discussed it with everyone first," and immediately smiled and replied casually that it was not a problem. He quickly stood and asked the whole group for their thoughts. "Anyway, now that everyone is gathered, should we head out right away?" He was ready too, wearing a smile full of anticipation. "Let us get moving." Goblins were tiny creatures, with intelligence no better than that of children, savage by nature and capable of using only crude tools. Their main target was raiding human settlements to steal property and livestock. One goblin by itself was not all that frightening, but these monsters were incredibly troublesome, because they always acted in packs. As soon as they entered the forest and explained to the whole team, "Lately, there have been more and more reports of goblins harassing the small villages along the Shinchak border. The last time we tracked down their nest, we were attacked by a wyvern instead, and that was when we met Kim Jian." After hearing the full story, the main character finally understood the situation. "I see." But right after that, he glanced to the side and said they should put that topic aside for now. Kim Jian had already noticed the group behind them. "Why do those people keep following us around?" And quickly explained everything from start to finish. Ever since the wyvern incident, the number of monsters around Shinchak has risen abnormally. So they came along to investigate that strange phenomenon, and at the same time, they are also here to protect us. Mary Chatelaine winked and flashed a bright smile as she proudly reminded them, "You should feel honored." She closed in from behind, raised her hand, and sneered that they had already humbled themselves enough by protecting low-tier steel badge hunters like them. Kim Jian forced down his anger, stepped forward, and coldly asked if there was not even one decent person in their group. The man standing beside the main character immediately turned and spoke up in their defense. He said he understood why they felt irritated after that first encounter, but despite appearances, the noble specialist party was genuinely a highly renowned group of hunters, and quickly ran through the party's track record. Even though they had only been formed for 2 years, they reached silver badge rank in just 1 year, racked up major achievements one after another, and were now considered the top candidates to set the all-time record for the fastest promotion to gold badge. The main character still looked unconvinced, turned back around, and asked with open irritation whether people like that were really worth respecting. Mary Chatelaine still would not stop. She kept staring at Ariel and repeatedly asked if she was really an elf and where she had come from. Right then, Brian walked over from behind and awkwardly reminded the young lady not to keep bothering other people, then asked her to come back over to their side, and looked up and forced a helpless smile, because this bunch really was weird beyond belief. The main character was holding himself back so hard his face had started to twist, and he even muttered that sooner or later he would have to teach that arrogant little girl a lesson. Without warning, the young man turned around and said in a serious tone that before they went any further, there were still a few things they needed to confirm clearly. Right after that, and started assigning roles. Since Kim Ji-an used heavy weapons, he would take the vanguard position in the formation. The remaining members were also assigned one by one to roles that suited them, while Sirius and Ariel would stay in the back line to provide support. Suddenly remembering something important, and turned to Ariel and asked what kind of magic she usually used, but she only tilted her head to one side with a puzzled look, as if she did not understand what he was asking. Seeing that, he scratched his cheek and hesitantly asked again, wondering if his question had really been that hard to understand. In the end, and had no choice but to explain in more detail. He said he was not especially well versed in magic, but he still knew it was divided into many different schools. For example, there were destruction magic, enhancement magic, alchemy magic, summoning magic, and even necromancy. From what he knew, this fantasy world contained countless branches of magic, each with completely different properties. To avoid any misunderstanding, he gave another example and said that Veronica over there excelled at enhancement magic. Most mages specialized in only one field, so if they understood someone's abilities clearly, building tactics would become far more effective, and lightly scratched the back of his neck and awkwardly admitted that this was honestly his first chance to work together with a mage. Normally, people who used magic had to be at least silver badge rank, and even at that level, you still rarely saw more than one or two of them. After hearing that, Ariel looked annoyed and stressed that she had thought he was about to say something more serious. Those things were obvious to begin with. Before the atmosphere even had time to settle, something suddenly shot down from high above at incredible speed. Her eyes instantly narrowed, and her entire presence changed in the blink of an eye. A wind blade as sharp as a knife tore through the air and almost drove straight into Ariel's face. Luckily, Kim Ji-an reacted fast enough and threw a punch that knocked the ambush away in an instant, and also jolted in shock, spun around, and hurried to see what on earth had just happened. Sirius clenched her teeth, her eyes full of worry as she immediately shifted into a guarded stance. Someone had just spotted the goblins and shouted in fear, unable to understand when those monsters had managed to close in all the way to this point. Kim Ji-an frowned at once, his whole body tensing as he raised his alertness to the highest level. Brian rushed forward to shield the formation and said in a low voice, asking if this was a goblin ambush. At that moment, Mary Chatelaine suddenly stretched out her hand in front of him as if to stop him. She immediately ordered that Brian did not need to make a move yet. Mary Chatelaine wanted to let the hunters handle it themselves. She said they should leave this matter to them, because at the end of the day, those people were hunters too. From the distance, a goblin roared and charged straight in with crazed aggression. But before it could even reach its target, it took a crushing punch right to the face. The one who struck was none other than Kim Ji-an. The main character turned around, sweat pouring down from the tension as he faced this discern of events. After only a few beats of fighting, the goblins had been wiped out, and bodies were strewn all across the ground. Some of them had even been taken down by vicious arrows that pierced straight through their bodies in a terrifying display. In only a short moment, the whole group had cleanly eliminated every monster that had tried to ambush them. Seeing that, he immediately got excited, flashed a bright grin, and sarcastically remarked that these things did not seem all that threatening after all, and put a hand on his hip and praised him, saying that Kim Ji-an had done an excellent job and that his combat skill really was outstanding. Ceres, however, swept her gaze around uneasily and said this was far too strange, because goblins normally did not take the initiative to ambush fully equipped hunters like this, and immediately agreed. He explained that goblins usually preferred weak targets like children or the elderly, yet this time they had targeted Ariel, a mage, right from the start. Whether it was intentional or not, it was still extremely unusual. After a brief moment of thought, and brought up their most important goal again and said that no matter what, they still had to find the nest and wipe these monsters out at the root. He quickly added his own guess that the number of goblins in the area was very likely far greater than just that small group. Only then did Kim Ji-an scratch his head in regret and say they should have kept one alive for questioning. But now the only choice left was to push deeper inside. At those words, everyone's expressions changed at once. Kim Ji-an then curiously asked what a goblin nest would actually look like. After that, he grew worried about something else and wondered whether these goblins were capable of communicating with each other. Right behind Kim Ji-an, a gigantic creature silently appeared before anyone could have expected it. He still had not noticed a thing and only stared blankly at everyone's reaction before asking why they all looked frozen stiff and whether something was wrong, and shouted a warning in panic, telling Kim Ji-an to be careful because danger was right behind him. Hearing that, he finally turned around calmly to get a clear look at whatever had appeared at his back. The monster now revealed its savage nature, raised its enormous claw, and slashed downward at blinding speed. Luckily, Mary Chatelaine rushed in at that exact moment and saved Kim Jian from the fatal attack. Clear irritation showed on her face, but her movement was decisive and completely without hesitation. Seeing that, the main character could only stand there with his mouth hanging open, too shocked to move. En's eyes also widened and everyone around them froze on the spot from sheer surprise. Kim Jian was stunned by what she had just done and immediately shouted Mary Chatelaine's name. Brian placed a hand on his shoulder and told him to fall back at once. After saying that, he stepped forward with overwhelming confidence and declared that they should leave everything here to his group. Kim Jian still stood where he was, his eyes showing clear hesitation and unease. Brian then moved a few steps closer, his gaze completely locked onto the monster in front of him. The moment he saw his opponent clearly, he was shocked to realize it was a Stone Mountain imp. A monster like that appearing this close to human territory was far too abnormal. Brian lowered his voice and warned Mary Chatelaine that, "My lady, it seems something was truly very wrong in this area." Mary Chatelaine immediately focused herself and reminded every member of her team that they absolutely could not afford to let their guard down. She understood the level of danger very clearly, so she continued by warning them that this enemy was definitely not going to be an easy opponent. Kim Jian could not keep standing by any longer, so he immediately spoke up and said that they would fight alongside them too. And suddenly cut him off and firmly said there was no need. He understood perfectly well how dangerous the situation was, so he said bluntly that if they rushed in now, they would only get in that team's way. Afraid Kim Jian might misunderstand, and quickly explained that of course everyone knew just how strong he was. But at the same time, he also had great faith in the battle-hardened noble specialists party. If they interfered, there was a high chance their side would only disrupt the smooth coordination that team had built through experience. And kept persuading him with visible concern, saying that in a situation like this, the best thing to do was trust them. After hearing that, Kim Jian only turned his face away, still looking hesitant and deeply conflicted. Behind them, Ariel suddenly let out a sigh, as if she had already grown thoroughly fed up with this entire situation. Brian looked back and immediately ordered Veronica to quickly enhance the fighting spirit of the entire group. She did not hesitate for even a second, and instantly shut her eyes tight while frowning in concentration. Right after that, Veronica stretched out her hand and cast a fighting spirit enhancement spell on her teammates. Aaron looked up with intense focus, while a sharp gleam also flashed through Brian's eyes, as if he were fully ready to step into action. A confident smile slowly appeared on Mary Chatelaine's lips, as though this situation was still completely under her control. The moment he saw that, Anne's jaw dropped in shock, unable to believe that she could enhance all three of them at the same time. John still stood exactly where he was, but a frightening cruelty had already surfaced in his eyes. In the very next instant, it kicked hard off the ground and shot upward like a monster preparing to unleash the next attack. John shot into the air at once, closing in on Mary Chatelaine's position in a single burst. She frowned and waited with patient focus, holding out for the exact instant to strike back. Mary Chatelaine raised her shield across her body and took the monster's devastating punch head-on. Gritting her teeth, she endured the impact and fought to keep her footing from being blown away. But of course, John had absolutely no intention of stopping there. In the distance, Erin drew her bow and locked onto the target in front of her. Brian immediately moved in sync, following the exact path of that arrow. Suddenly, the troll jerked its head up and let out a spine-chilling roar. It was struck head-on, then instantly toppled backward from the blow. Mary Chatelaine shot a quick glance behind her, then spun around in a flash. Working together with Brian, she used her momentum to launch him high into the air. At that moment, she placed all of her hopes on Brian's ability. The troll lifted its face with a savage glare, momentarily unsure how to respond. He swung his dagger and slashed across, ripping open its face. John immediately clutched the eye that was spraying blood without stopping. Kim Jian was stunned by how unbelievably precise the group's teamwork was. Even he had to admit that this party moved in perfect rhythm, like a single unified body. They truly looked like a hunter team tempered through countless life and death battles. Brian clenched his teeth and tensely realized that even though he had stolen its vision, the wound still was not fatal enough. In alarm, he warned everyone that a troll's regenerative ability was terrifying. It would heal in the blink of an eye. For a lineup lacking offensive magic, this was truly the worst possible matchup. Mary Chatelaine smiled and immediately proposed another plan. In that case, aim straight for the heart. That was the source of its rebirth. Veronica, prepare the reinforcement now. The Noble Specialist squad was famous in hunter circles for its steady lineup and exceptionally efficient coordination. Even so, they still had one major fatal weakness. They lacked explosive firepower. Aaron's crossbow took far too long to reload, and it was hard for it to inflict major damage on giant monsters. As for Brian, the man who always held the front line beside her, he used twin daggers. That kind of weapon was clearly unsuited for dealing with large targets. Veronica, the group's only mage, possessed nothing but enhancement magic. Because of that, there was almost no way to expect direct damage from her. Mary Chatelaine, the leader of the entire party, used a special kind of weapon, a lance. But that lance had originally been designed for cavalry. In the hands of infantry, its weight shifted backward, limiting movement, and making it difficult to unleash its full power. Even so, this team made up for that weakness with an extremely unusual tactic. They poured every last bit of enhancement magic to the absolute limit into a single person. Veronica closed her eyes, loudly chanted her spell, and unleashed a physical enhancement spell. Light immediately flared around Mary Chatelaine. Her speed was boosted. Her defense was reinforced. Veronica kept pushing her power even higher, and even the force of her weapon was enhanced. Thanks to that chain of stacked buffs, she transformed from an ordinary infantry fighter into an explosive burst of power and speed in an instant. In the end, she reached a velocity that far surpassed even a true cavalry rider. Ceres witnessed the sight and could only gape in utter shock. Ariel frowned as well, watching closely without looking away for even a second. That was exactly why the Hunter Association had given her the nickname Golden Unicorn. The moment John saw Mary Chatelaine charging toward him, panic struck him instantly. She drove straight through in one unstoppable line and pierced clean through its body. Mary Chatelaine curled her lips into a grin, her smile brimming with exhilaration. Kim Jian seemed frozen in place, and was no better, completely unable to believe the scene before his eyes. Mary Chatelaine had even torn a massive hole right through the middle of the troll's body. She laughed in delight and sneered mockingly. A puny goblin dares stand against me, and this is all it amounts to. See that, this is the power of our party. But right after that, Mary Chatelaine suddenly stiffened. A spray of blood burst outward without warning, and went rigid with fear at what he had just seen, and all he could do was cry out Mary Chatelaine's name in panic. Brian rushed over at once, deeply worried about her condition. "My lady." In fear, he repeated that he had warned her already. This method would put far too much strain on her body. Mary Chatelaine turned back, still calm on the surface. A noble must set an example for others. An injury like this is nothing worth mentioning. She forced herself back up and gave an order, unaware that an arrow had already pierced straight into her chest. For now, they had to retreat and find reinforcements. Brian's face darkened, and he stood there frozen in shock. Mary Chatelaine looked down at her chest, still unable to understand what had happened. Then, all at once, she collapsed to the ground. Mary Chatelaine's face gradually turned pale, and the dizziness in her mind was obvious. In the darkness, countless eyes were silently fixed on them. It was an entire horde of trolls, along with goblins, now revealing themselves. Brian ground his teeth and took a fearful step back. What the hell is going on here? By this point, the entire group had been completely surrounded. Anne's face drained of color as he screamed in panic. Where did all these monsters even come from? Suddenly, Mary Chatelaine forced herself to shout out Veronica's name. Startled by the call, Veronica answered back awkwardly. "Yes, I'm here." In a panic, she ordered Veronica to immediately take everyone, along with Aaron, and get out of this area at once. Mary Chatelaine snapped off the arrow shaft, endured the pain, and decided she would stay behind to hold them off and buy more time. Seeing that, Aaron anxiously objected. "You can't do this, Lady Mary Chatelaine." Brian also rushed over, completely unwilling to accept that command. "My lady." Mary Chatelaine understood perfectly, so she softened her voice as she spoke. "Brian, I know what you're going to say." She still drew her weapon and declared with firm resolve, "But please do not try to stop me." Mary Chatelaine struggled to stand, placing duty above all else. "This is the obligation of a noble, and now is the time for me to fulfill the duty of my bloodline." He looked back at her, his hesitation and reluctance to leave written plainly across his face. Right then, Kim Jian's voice suddenly rang out, dripping with sarcasm. "Wow, that sure sounds dramatic and heroic." He strolled forward casually and reminded her that she could not just ignore his existence like that. Carrying his staff as he advanced, Kim Jian asked coldly, "Do you really think I'm the kind of person who runs away and abandons his teammates?" Everyone turned to look at him, their eyes filled with shock. Ariel tilted her head as well, clearly puzzled by the main character's attitude. Ceres widened her eyes at the words that had just come out of his mouth. Annoyed, Mary Chatelaine shouted again, "Stop being stubborn and leave now. Didn't you see the battle we just fought?" She did not place any faith in him at all. With a crude weapon like that, there was no way he could kill even a single goblin. Mary Chatelaine kept emphasizing the danger. Even if he somehow got lucky enough to kill one, he still could not stand against an entire horde of monsters. Even so, Kim Jian replied calmly, "I understand. But compared to the enemies I faced while traveling with Urs, this bunch is not even worth worrying about." That line made her completely furious. "Stop talking nonsense and go. We truly do not have any time left to..." At that exact moment, a troll suddenly appeared behind Mary Chatelaine and threw an incredibly powerful punch. When she realized it, all she could feel was that it was already too late. "Oh no, this is over." At that very instant, Jin Jian shot forward like a bolt of lightning. The troll was forced to arch back and crash flat onto the ground. Mary Chatelaine stood frozen in place, stunned speechless. Even Brian had never expected the main guy to strike with such ruthless decisiveness. The troll clutched its wounded shoulder in agony. He even went out of his way to provoke her. "Hey, you veteran huntress." Right after that, he flashed a smile and asked curtly, "So what's our next move?" Seeing that Mary Chatelaine was still hesitating, the young man reminded her, "You saw it too. Everyone is waiting for your decision." Only then did she slowly turn her head and look behind her, and immediately spoke up with conviction. "We'll definitely fight beside you to the very end." Aaron smiled in agreement. "There's no way we'd abandon our leader at a time like this." Veronica also waited tensely for Mary Chatelaine to make her call. Her face had gone pale from sheer shock. Then Mary Chatelaine let out a soft, helpless sigh. After that, she calmly opened her eyes. At last, Mary Chatelaine gave the order. "Brian and Terrace, prioritize wiping out the goblins first. There are too many monsters, so we have to deal with them one by one." She quickly assigned their roles. "While Jin Jian solos the trolls one at a time, the rest of us will harass the others and hold them back." Right then, Ariel suddenly cut in. "Wait." She planted a hand on her hip and said with total confidence, "Leave this to me alone." The main guy turned back in surprise and asked, "Don't tell me you really figured out a way already." The corner of Ariel's lips curved into a mysterious smile. She immediately fired a question back at him. "Earlier, you asked what kind of magic I specialize in, right?" Ariel explained calmly, "The truth is, I don't have just one specialty." Her eyes shone with absolute confidence. "Because there isn't a single type of magic in this world that I can't use." With that, Ariel stretched out her hand and shouted, "Mana amplification." She kept chanting spell after spell to magnify her ability to gather mana. Ariel's body slowly rose off the ground as the elemental attributes around her were enhanced. A blazing crimson flame coiled around her. Wrathful fire dragon. The flames instantly surged straight toward the monsters. One troll's bulged wide in terror. In the blink of an eye, they were swallowed by a tornado of fire and completely trapped inside it. Ariel pointed her staff forward, controlling the raging sea of flames. An entire stretch of forest was instantly drowned in fire. Even so, Ariel's magic staff still had not stopped glowing. The main guy stared with wide eyes, stunned by her terrifying power. All he could do was stand behind her and watch Ariel's back in silence. Right after that, she slowly turned her head. Ariel beamed brightly and reminded everyone it's done. The problem's been taken care of. As the flames gradually died down, huge sheets of ash drifted through the sky in front of Jin Jian. Mary Chatelaine went pale, then suddenly burst into laughter, as if she still couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. But right after that, she collapsed to the ground. This had clearly pushed her body past its limit. Mary Chatelaine crumpled in pain and fell face first onto the ground. Everyone cried out in panic at the same time. Lady Mary Chatelaine. But her complexion only kept getting paler. The doctor immediately reached a conclusion. The poison Mary Chatelaine was struck with is a lethal toxin. Even he couldn't identify its exact origin. It seems to be an extremely rare poison, one hardly ever seen in this region. The doctor honestly laid out the limits of what he could do. "For now, I've done everything possible. But if we don't find an antidote soon, it'll be very hard to save her life." After hearing that, Brian could only lower his head heavily. "So that's how it is." Outside, the main guy stood with his arms crossed in worry, unsure whether Mary Chatelaine could survive this brush with death. Ariel also sat quietly in silence as if she were thinking something over. He turned to her in confusion and asked, "I thought she was a noble. Shouldn't she be getting treated in some luxurious estate? Why is a young lady lying in a rundown inn like this?" Erin closed her eyes and explained, "That was in the past. Things aren't like that anymore." Hearing that, he instantly froze. "What?" Jin Jian pressed her with one question after another. "What do you mean? Why isn't she a noble anymore?" Brian clearly still calls her Milady and stays by her side at all times. Erin calmly confirmed, "It's true that Mary Chatelaine was once born into the nobility." She added, "And it's also true that Brian was her personal guard." At that moment, he was still keeping watch inside the sick room, guarding Mary Chatelaine. Erin continued, "But all of that belongs to the past now." The story immediately shifted back to when Brian was still a child and had been imprisoned in a wagon. A prison wagon, escorted by soldiers, was transporting him away. Above them, the flag of the ruling faction fluttered in the wind. Brian wasn't the only one inside the wagon. There were two other people with him. A man with a scar-covered face glanced over and studied the boy. After a while, he finally spoke. "Hey kid, what crime did you commit to get thrown in here?" But Brian stayed silent, staring out through the wagon door without saying a word. The man rested his hands behind his head and sighed. "Fine. If you don't want to talk, whatever. People captured in war usually end up at the execution block anyway. What does the charge even matter now?" Suddenly, hurried footsteps rang out from outside. One wary soldier grumbled seriously. Wouldn't it be less trouble to just execute these criminals on the spot and be done with it? The more he thought about it, the more exhausted he felt from this meaningless prisoner escort. Another man glanced over and replied, "We still have to keep up proper appearances." He went on, "It's not like everyone in there necessarily committed a capital crime. There just isn't time for trials, so they tie them all up and execute them together to make things quick." The soldiers kept talking without end. That's why they say if you do something bad, you'd better know how to avoid the consequences. But the moment he finished speaking, an arrow pierced straight through his throat. There was an ambush. Inside, the Wagambrian's eyes flew open in shock. Outside, a completely different flag bearing another crest had appeared. A new force of soldiers was riding on horseback along the high slope. Their leader's face was fully covered, so no one could make out what he looked like. A blade was pulled free from a victim's blood-soaked body. The entire escort unit was wiped out in the blink of an eye. After the battlefield had been cleared, one soldier stepped forward and bowed his head. "My lord." That man then asked, "How should we deal with these prisoners?" A rider sitting tall on horseback turned back and coldly asked for his father's approval. "This lot are all criminals. If you ask me, we should execute them on the spot and be done with it." The man standing in the middle started trembling all over the instant he heard that. The heavy thud of armored boots against the ground signaled that a soldier was approaching. Brian suddenly lifted his head. The main character wanted to see who had just arrived. Risley planted both hands on his hips and questioned them directly. "What exactly are your crimes?" The other man hurriedly tried to explain himself. "Sir, we're just small fry. We only pick through scrap metal on the battlefield so we can earn enough to eat." But before he could finish, a sword slash tore through the air. His head was cut clean off in an instant. Risley only glanced over with an irritated look. The man beside him was so terrified that he shrank back immediately. The severed head slowly rolled to a stop right at his feet. Even so, the main character did not show the slightest reaction. Risley looked at him and found it strange. This boy didn't have a trace of life left in him. He was like a candle that had already burned down to the wick. That only made him more curious, so he asked bluntly, "Do you truly have nothing left tying you to this life?" Risley stared at him, then continued giving orders. "What is your crime? Tell me." At that moment, the boy's eyes suddenly darkened. He spoke in a voice full of fear. "If you're going to kill me, then do it quickly." The young man even guessed what the other side was thinking. "Or are you hesitating because I'd be a nameless child you killed for no reason?" Risley only looked down at him in silence. A soldier immediately rushed forward. Furious, he shouted, "You little brat. How dare you speak so insolently?" Risley, on the other hand, smiled instead. He even praised him. "This kid has guts." The boy himself couldn't make sense of Risley's reaction either. Risley looked down at him and spoke with clear interest. "I'm starting to like you." Right after that, Risley came up with an idea. "This boy seems like he'd make a fitting gift for my youngest daughter." As soon as he said that, he turned and gave an order. "Put this one in the carriage at once." The person beside him softly called out in surprise, "Father." The main character's mind instantly turned into a tangled mess. So from now on, was he really going to live as a slave? This life was truly wrecked beyond saving. A hot bath had already been prepared in advance. He sat down in it and soaked himself with a sense of deep relief. He was exhausted and utterly bewildered. What the hell was even going on here? The scene then shifted at once to a magnificent and extravagant palace. A maid pinched her nose and frowned in open disgust. "Who do you think you're gonna meet looking that filthy?" She looked visibly annoyed and snapped at him. "You want to meet the young lady in that state? Absolutely not. Go wash yourself properly right now." And that was exactly why he got dragged off to be scrubbed clean. The main character looked up in shock. Even a slave gets a proper bath here. This treatment was way too luxurious. Were these people really that rich? Then he suddenly noticed something odd. The young lady. These people were seriously reckless, handing a criminal like him over to her. He couldn't help wondering what kind of girl she was. Before he went in, someone reminded him very carefully, "Remember this. You are absolutely not to show the young lady even the slightest disrespect." They didn't just warn him, they threatened him to his face. "If you dare do anything stupid, even death won't be enough to atone for it." Hearing that much nagging left him drained. It was enough to make his head ache. Just then, an announcement rang out without warning. "Our young lady is arriving." From above, Mary Chatelaine slowly descended and spoke up with curiosity. "Is it?" The little girl looked incredibly excited. "So you're the gift father said he had for me?" He looked at Mary Chatelaine and froze for a brief second. "She's really tiny." She immediately pointed at him and bluntly criticized him. "Father said he picked you up somewhere, but you look shabby, and you don't have any presence about you at all." He lowered his head and forced down his emotions. By that point, he was definitely starting to get irritated. She giggled, then innocently declared, "Still, since you're a gift from father, I'll try to treasure you at least a little." The main character could only stand there helplessly, offering no reaction at all. Then Mary Chatelaine folded her arms and asked, "Hey, what's your name?" He answered shortly and indifferently, "My name is Brian." The little girl tossed her hair and turned away, only to sneer at once. "That name sounds so ordinary with no class whatsoever." This brat really had a talent for driving people insane. He was starting to panic for real. Was he seriously supposed to spend the rest of his life serving a child like this? He frowned but still tried to reassure himself. No way. There's no way that could actually happen. All of a sudden, Mary Chatelaine called out a name. "Brian." The young man stood still where he was, completely unable to figure out what she was about to do. She pointed ahead and declared, "From this moment on, your name will be Brian." With that, Mary Chatelaine suddenly opened her hand toward him. The little girl gave him a much friendlier smile. "I hope we get along from now on, Brian." He frowned in complete confusion. Brian is my name. It was obvious that he didn't like the way she said it. Somehow it made his own name sound weirdly rustic. People always say that human beings are frighteningly adaptable creatures. Instead of wandering alleys and street corners to steal and rob like before, he now spent his entire day doing household chores he had never once touched in his life. Instead of forcing down scraps of rotten food just to drag out another day, he was now greeted with a gentle voice. You're back. Go find somewhere comfortable and sit down. He was even given hot meals prepared just for him. Today, the young lady, instead of facing bitter enemies and assassins lurking for his life every day, he now only heard a maid's hurried voice calling from afar, Brian. The people around him now were all kind and welcoming. The maid smiled brightly and offered to help. Let me give you a hand. Even though this life had only lasted for a few short months. Even so, he felt incredibly at ease here, as if this had always been the place where he truly belonged. The friendly maid spoke up with concern. Are you settling in all right here? The main character kept his usual cool expression and replied, it's fine, I guess. The girl looked over at him with a careful, searching gaze. Suddenly, the maid reached out and touched his forehead. She wanted to check his temperature. Let me see. After that, she even smiled and praised him. If you kept your forehead uncovered, Brian, you'd look much more handsome. He immediately blushed bright red and turned away. What was that about? Why would she suddenly say something like that? But even in the middle of this peaceful life, there was still one thing that gave him a serious headache. Right in the middle of a calm moment, Mary Chatelaine suddenly shouted at the top of her lungs, "Where's Brian?" He hurried over, opened door, and asked, "Did you call for me, young lady?" Mary Chatelaine was sitting on the bed, hugging a stuffed bear. She puffed out her cheeks and immediately made a demand. This young lady suddenly has a craving for sweets. And that was the real problem. Whenever she felt like it, she called him over for little errands like this. She could obviously have just ordered a maid. Mary Chatelaine turned her face away in frustration and explained, "Mother banned me from eating sweets anymore. Those maids won't listen to me at all." He was instantly put in an awkward spot and frowned in hesitation. The little girl remained seated on the bed, puffing out her cheeks in visible dissatisfaction. In the end, he held one side of his face and let out a helpless sigh. What a pain. A short while later, the table was already covered with all kinds of macarons. She perched on the chair, happily swinging her legs with obvious delight. Mary Chatelaine was so happy that she savored each pastry at a leisurely pace, treating every bite like a precious treasure. Then she blurted out praise after praise, saying that only Brian could possibly be this capable. Mary Chatelaine looked openly surprised and curiously asked how he had managed to sneak sweets back without the tightly guarded watch noticing him. Right after that, she even joked with playful suspicion that maybe brother Brian had once been a notorious master thief before coming here. Just like that, Brian gradually transformed, no longer the street urchin drifting from alley to alley, but the loyal retainer of House Chatillon. While busy working, the main lead suddenly heard someone call, "Brian," and instantly turned to look behind him. By then, the grown-up Mary Chatelaine was coming down the stairs, saying she had heard her father had finished his campaign and returned to the estate. Hearing that, he smiled gently and happily said this was truly the good news all of them had been waiting for so long. The moment he finished speaking, footsteps echoed down from above. At last, Raisley returned safely and said he was finally back with his family. Catherine smiled warmly and joyfully welcomed her husband home in one piece. He walked in at an unhurried pace, looking utterly at ease, because after such a long and grueling campaign, returning home felt genuinely refreshing. Just then, a familiar voice suddenly rang out with excitement. "Father!" Seeing his daughter run toward him, Raisley immediately broke into a delighted smile and called out, "My Mary Chatelaine." He pulled her into his arms and fondly said that his precious daughter had grown so quickly he had nearly failed to recognize her. Right after that, Raisley's gaze lifted slightly as if he had just noticed something. The young man standing behind her merely nodded and politely bowed to him. Then two more people stepped forward from behind, joking that it seemed the girl only had eyes for her father now, and had completely ignored everyone else. Mary Chatelain's face immediately lit up, and she cried out in delight that her two older brothers had come back too. Leon wore a gentle smile and warmly praised his little sister, saying she truly looked like a young lady now. Zonal, on the other hand, was still the old tease, saying that even as a young lady, she was still as tiny as a sparrow. He even pushed her head down with one hand, and Mary Chatelaine instantly yelped in protest, annoyed that her hair had been messed up. Over on this side, Leon suddenly placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. He smiled in thanks and said he truly appreciated how well Brian had looked after his sister. The main lead lifted his eyes and answered with a courteous smile, "Young master." Raisley looked around at everyone and declared that it was rare for the whole family to be reunited like this, so they should all share a meal together. Immediately, the dishes were brought down and arranged neatly across the table. Before long, everyone was seated in full, ready to begin their family meal. Raisley cut into a piece of meat and ate while talking with an easy, relaxed smile. Mary Chatelaine also chattered brightly, telling him him all kinds of stories about what had happened during that time. Leon could not hide the happiness plainly written across his face either. The entire space seemed filled with the warmth of reunion. Looking at that scene, he could not help feeling happy along with them. After the meal, the servants quickly cleared away the dishes and tidied everything up. Just then, Risley walked over from behind and called softly, "Brian." He turned back with a slight start and respectfully asked what the Lord required. With a serious expression, Risley said he wanted to speak with him alone for a moment. The main lead immediately froze, a strange confusion stirring in his heart. After that, the scene shifted into the cool stillness of night. A bottle of wine was set down on the seat. The two men sat side by side in a heavy, oppressive silence. Risley closed his eyes and slowly remarked that before they knew it, Brian had already spent a full 5 years living in this estate. He gently asked how life had been for him lately and whether he was comfortable here. Hearing that, the young man closed his eyes slightly and thought for a moment. Then he turned toward him, flashed a bright smile, and answered that everything was wonderful and he had nothing to complain about. Risley laughed with easy amusement and said that just by looking at his face, he had already guessed the answer beforehand. He could see the change far too clearly, because Brian's current complexion was nothing like the half-dead face he had worn 5 years earlier. Hearing that, the main lead felt even more grateful and sincerely said it was all thanks to the Lord's kindness. He smiled with deep gratitude and said he could never forget the life-saving grace and second chance Risley had given him. It was Risley who helped him recover a reason to keep living in this world. But at that exact moment, something in Risley's eyes suddenly changed. Then he unexpectedly spoke a loaded line. "In that case, the life you owe me." Risley's face turned frighteningly cold in an instant as he asked whether Brian was willing to use that life to serve his purpose. At those words, Brian's expression instantly stiffened. The night wind blew softly, making the surrounding trees tremble with a faint rustle. From outside the estate, a rapid thunder of hooves rang out. A great number of people had come charging straight to this place. Suddenly, an arm rose high into the night. Geoffrey appeared with a cruel expression and coldly ordered the soldiers to move. In his eyes, nothing remained but hatred and unshakable resolve. A bloody night was about to descend, yet no one knew what disaster was waiting ahead. As for Brian, he sprinted at full speed, threw open the door, and shouted for the young lady. Mary Chatelaine woke groggily and asked in surprise if it was really Brian, and why he was looking for her so late at night. Panting hard, he urgently pressed her to leave this place at once and hide. The more she heard, the more confused she became, unable to understand why he was suddenly saying such strange things. The corner of Risley's mouth curved slightly, and his fixed gaze looked as though he had seen through everything. So in the end, that old fox had finally made his move. From the distance, a heavy voice rang out. Geoffrey. This man Geoffrey was the head of the noble association of the Central Kingdom. He coldly said that had he not already made it clear before, this was the only path left for them to preserve their lives. Leon's face at that moment looked extremely displeased. At that time, Geoffrey was standing firmly before the city gate. Leon raised his sword and coldly asked if that could really be called a way to survive. His eyes were sharp as steel as he demanded to know whether betraying one's lord and bowing to become the Empire's hound was supposed to be survival. Hearing that, Geoffrey faltered for a brief moment. After a beat of silence, he lowered his voice and admitted that he truly had not expected the man's loyalty to endure all the way to the very end. But right after that, Geoffrey raised his voice and said that not everyone had the courage to choose an honorable death like he had. Elsewhere, two figures were dashing forward at incredible speed. One hand was being forcefully pulled ahead, allowing not even the slightest delay. Mary Chatelaine still had no idea what was happening and could only run after the main lead in a panic. She shouted in alarm, asking where on earth Brian was trying to take her. But he did not slow down at all. Instead, he sped up even more and shouted that they had to leave immediately. His brows drew tight, and his eyes were filled with the kind of resolve that showed he had already made up his mind. The scene suddenly rewound to earlier, when the two of them had been sitting and talking in peace, right before a bloody massacre was about to swallow everything whole. In that fateful moment, Risley solemnly said that he wanted to entrust Brian with something. Brian went still when Risley instructed him to protect and look after Mary Chatelaine in his place. He immediately frowned and asked what about the Lord himself, but Risley only told him to focus on fulfilling his own duty well. Back in the present, Risley was facing Geoffrey head-on in a life-and-death confrontation. Risley narrowed his eyes, unwavering and utterly unbowed. As for me, I will see the duty of the one at the top through to the very end. The sword slowly rose through the thin veil of smoke, but don't think that alone is enough to make me waver. Risley spoke with open mockery. You really think this ragtag pack of soldiers is enough to bind me? He let out a laugh. There's no way I'd come here empty-handed while facing the strongest man in the kingdom. The moment he saw the scene before him, Risley froze in place. The sudden appearance of a gigantic serpent threw him into utter shock. The 12 Zodiac Palaces? Raisley roared in fury. Jeffrey, you dare lead enemy generals straight into the capital? In the blink of an eye, the castle was swallowed by a sea of flames. Screams rang out everywhere. The soldiers slaughtered without sparing a soul, and the civilians fled in panic in every direction. Mary Chatelain stood frozen before the horrific scene. Her eyes were wide with terror. The maid had already collapsed amid the flames, a large pool of blood spreading beneath her. Brian immediately yanked her away from there. Seeing that Mary Chatelain was still standing there in shock, he turned back and shouted, "My lady, we have to leave now." Brian turned fully around and gripped her small, slender shoulders tightly. He roared, "There's no more time to hesitate. My lady, please pull yourself together." Mary Chatelain trembled so hard she could barely speak. "Brian, what in the world is happening?" But Brian gave no answer. He only seized her hand and dragged her away at once. Just like that, the two of them plunged headlong into the chaos. He shoved the door open and shouted loudly, "Sister Linda, are the horses ready yet?" But inside, a cold figure was already standing there waiting for them. Hugo Pagetti's gaze was icy, and the darkness on his face was enough to send chills down anyone's spine. Brian stopped short the instant he saw the murdered maid's body lying on the floor. The man still held a blood-stained sword in his hand as he gave a faint laugh. "Looks like I arrived at just the right time." Hugo Pagetti casually hoisted his sword onto his shoulder. "Don't look so terrified." He narrowed his eyes in warning. "This will be over so fast, you won't even have time to feel the pain." Suddenly, a fierce slash shot in from behind, aimed straight at Hugo Pagetti. His reflexes were lightning fast, and he instantly dropped low to the ground to evade the strike. All three of them widened their eyes at once, stunned by the sudden turn of events. The man who had just appeared left everyone speechless. It was him. Renan Chatelain arrived in the nick of time, pulling Brian and Mary Chatelain back from death's door. He immediately raised his sword, the tip aimed directly at Hugo Pagetti. Then he glanced back and ordered in a low voice, "Brian, take Mary Chatelain and get out of here right now." Brian cried out in alarm, "Second young master." Renan Chatelain shouted with finality, "Move, now." Under that crushing force of will, Brian could only grit his teeth and obey. Mary Chatelain broke down into sobs. "Big brother!" Brian squeezed his eyes shut, forcing down his emotions so he could keep the young woman in his arms safe. Meanwhile, she kept reaching toward Renan Chatelain, crying in utter despair. His back remained firm and towering, as steady as an unshakable wall. Hugo Pagetti braced a hand on his knee and sneered. "I was already annoyed about being sent to catch a few little fish on the run, but who knew I'd stumble into luck like this?" He looked up at him and said, "Meeting the second young master of the Chatelain family, the most renowned knightly house in the Central Kingdom, is quite a thrill." Hugo Pagetti mocked that this was a rare chance to cross blades with Renan Chatelain. In response, Renan only raised a brow. "That's right, I've heard your name for a long time too." He lowered his voice, his gaze locked on the man before him. Hugo Pagetti. Elsewhere, the pounding of hooves echoed without pause along the escape route. Brian and Mary Chatelain had finally escaped the castle for the moment and managed to keep their lives. She clung tightly to Brian's back as tears streamed down without end. Brian pressed his lips into a hard line, his eyes tense as if buried beneath countless heavy thoughts. By then, the horse had already carried them far from the burning castle. Sometime later, in another peaceful place, the firelight still blazed as if it had never once intended to die out. Exhaustion and crushing worry were written all over Brian's face. He sat beside the bed, silently keeping watch over Mary Chatelain. Suddenly, a hurried voice rang out. "The investigation results from the Hunters Guild have come in." The words instantly snapped him back to reality, and his eyes flew open. Elsewhere, Anne came running over, panting for breath. They found traces of magic on the bodies of those monsters. Kim Jian and Ariel immediately focused on her words. This was most likely the work of beast manipulators, the kind of heretical beast tamers who control monsters from the shadows. The main character let out a quiet sigh. So the ones behind this were those beast controllers after all. While the atmosphere was stretched tight as a bowstring, Brian stood above them, silently observing everyone below. Before long, everyone noticed his presence. They all froze at once. "Brian," Aaron immediately asked in concern, "What'd the doctor say? Is Mary Chatelain going to be okay?" Brian did not answer right away. His gaze remained fixed ahead, heavy with unreadable thoughts. He looked toward Kim Jian and spoke in a low voice, "Kim Jian." Then he turned to Ariel as well. "You too, Ariel." Brian knitted his brows tightly. "Could the two of you help me with something?" In another place, a soft laugh echoed out with eerie menace. On that beautiful face, crimson lips curled into a cold, unreadable smile. An elegant hand slowly lifted, as though everything lay perfectly within her grasp. Her voice was gentle, yet full of pressure. "From manpower and monsters to poison, even the worst possible moment to strike, I provided you with everything." The young woman crossed her legs in calculated ease, while the man before her trembled as he insisted everything had been prepared perfectly. That mysterious woman was Aquanastalis, one who despised humanity to her very bones. She curled her lips in scorn. "And even then, you still managed to fail?" The man immediately dropped to his knees and begged through tears, "Please forgive us. We truly know we were wrong. It's just that a mage suddenly interfered and ruined the entire plan. He shook uncontrollably, his face twisted in fear. Please, my lady, grant us one last chance. Aquanastalis glanced at the people prostrated on the floor and spoke in a taunting tone. You want another chance? Let me think. Strange sounds began to echo, like an omen of disaster. She coldly declared, I've already been far too generous in giving you this many chances. Hugo Paghetti sat down, rummaged through the soldiers, and asked, so what's your next move? From among them, he pulled out a vial of blue potion. He slipped the vial into his pocket, then asked again, are you really planning to abandon this region just like that? Aquanastalis laughed darkly. What else can be done? Things have already come to this. She calmly analyzed the situation. The surprise assault has failed, so the defenses throughout the territory will definitely be tightened more than ever. Aquanastalis continued, and on top of that, the Hunters Guild will surely speed up its investigation into this incident. She lifted her pale hand and considered the matter in silence. If we make a move ourselves right now, we may alert the guild. Aquanastalis's gaze shifted slightly elsewhere, and more importantly than that, she thought of Ayres and her voice turned cold. I have absolutely no desire to offend Lord Ayres in the slightest. Aquanastalis lifted a finger to the corner of his mouth and smiled faintly, still looking perfectly calm, as if he were merely watching a play unfold. Anyway, he had only joined this trip in a half-serious, half-amused mood. Maybe it was finally time to pack up and head back. Hugo Paghetti saw everything. He simply remained silent and watched from the sidelines. He spoke slowly, saying that as for him, there were still a few matters here that he needed to settle first. The corner of Hugo Paghetti's thin lips curled upward, and a scheming gleam flashed openly in his eye. He thought of Mary Chatelaine. That old debt still had not been fully repaid, even now. The man was blasted off to the side, and a huge mouthful of blood sprayed from his lips. He collapsed flat and rolled across the ground in a pitiful, miserable heap. A taunting voice rang out. My mood isn't very good right now, so you'd better keep that in mind. Brian brushed off his shoulder lightly, then said in a cold voice that he had one piece of advice to offer. His gaze was as sharp as a blade. If you still want to keep that miserable little life of yours, then you'd better tell the whole truth. Kim Jian stood to one side with a broken wooden club slung over his shoulder. He glanced over, his eyes filled with quiet thought and calculation. All around them, countless captives had been forced to kneel on the ground. Ariel was also sitting nearby, silently watching everything that was happening. The man shouted that he truly knew nothing at all. As for those goblins or those beast tamers, he said they had never seen them before. Brian's voice dropped into a growl as he told him not to lie. The disgust in his eyes was impossible to miss. Right after that, Brian lowered the tip of his sword and aimed it straight at the man. For people like you who specialize in watching everything that enters and leaves this area, there is no way you could have missed a large group of monsters and mages like that. Isn't your trade stalking prey like them and robbing them blind? The man trembled and stammered that he was telling the truth and knew nothing. In a situation like this, why would he risk his life to lie to him? Brian could not be bothered to hear any more and drove his sword down without hesitation. Who knew what filthy thoughts trash like you were hiding in your heads? The man could only squeeze his eyes shut and wait in despair for the killing blow to fall. But just as the blade was about to strike, a hand clamped down on Brian's arm and stopped him cold. He immediately whipped his head around to look at the person who had intervened. Kim Jian spoke up and said that he thought tormenting the man to this extent was already more than enough. He stated bluntly that the only reason he had come here was to help find an antidote for Mary Chatelaine. Looking at the pitiful man, Kim Jian made it clear that he had absolutely no intention of getting involved in murder or savage torture. Brian violently slapped his hand away, his whole attitude brimming with irritation. He growled that he could guarantee Kim Jian would not have to dirty his own hands with this kind of filth. Kim Jian shot back at once that standing there and watching without stopping it was no different from killing someone himself. Hearing that, Brian fell silent. His eyes locked onto Kim Jian, and killing intent surged from him like flames. After a while, he slowly calmed down and finally closed his eyes. Brian coldly spat out a single line, "Get out of my sight." Once they were released, the group looked as if they had come back from the dead, scrambling over one another to flee. Even so, Brian still had not let go of his anger, and he asked whether Kim Jian was satisfied with his own kindness now. Brian was starting to lose patience. Because of Kim Jian's actions, their chance of tracking down the beast tamers had become even slimmer. Kim Jian frowned and asked what he meant, and Brian replied with certainty that those people definitely had the only antidote. Brian shouted that while Kim Jian was busy pretending to be noble, the young lady was still edging closer to death with every passing second. The moment he finished speaking, he swung his sword and charged straight at Kim Jian. Meanwhile, Ariel remained seated in the same spot, her eyes half closed as if she were focusing on sensing something. Suddenly, she snapped her eyes open, and her expression changed completely. Ariel spoke up and said she had found it. The corner of her lips lifted slightly as she added that someone had just used magic from a location very close by. In another corner of the forest, the atmosphere had also become taut as a drawn bowstring. Ariel was breathing in ragged gasps, and it was obvious that her stamina was nearly exhausted. Kim Jian turned back and called out, "Hey Ariel, you..." The moment he saw her staggering, he could not help bluntly remarking that her stamina was unbelievably terrible. Ariel planted her staff against the ground, her face deathly pale, and said that she was worn out, and that he should go on ahead. Hearing that, Kim Jian could only sigh helplessly and mutter, "Seriously, are you really that weak?" Brian immediately turned and ran off, saying that if that was the case, then he would go ahead first. Kim Jian instantly shouted after him, "Hey, are you really just going to leave me behind?" Brian only glanced back and replied that he truly could not afford to waste even a single second more. After hearing that, Kim Jian could only fall silent, not knowing what else he could possibly say. He turned and called out that if she was too tired, then he could carry her on his back. But at that exact moment, Kim Jian jolted in shock because Ariel had vanished without a trace. The sight truly rattled him, and his lips visibly began to tremble. Elsewhere, a hand leisurely raised a cloth and wiped a sword blade clean. Reflected on the shining blade was the face of Hugo Pagati. He vaguely recalled that it must have been 5 years ago. In a cold voice, he said that he had never expected the little chatelaine girl who escaped back then to be hiding in a place this remote. The corners of Hugo Patty's thin lips slowly lifted into a smile. The sinister look on his face grew even more pronounced. What an unexpected stroke of luck for me. In another area, the soft, unhurried sound of footsteps slowly echoed through the air. Ariel was moving alone along a forest path, slowly making her way forward. She let out a small breath of relief, as if she had just shaken off a bit of pressure. But then Ariel opened her eyes, and a thought flashed through her mind when she heard the sound echoing back. "It feels like I got lost." She looked around in alarm and grumbled inwardly that her cursed lack of direction had to flare up at a time like this. She needed to find a way to regroup with Kim Jian as fast as possible. All of a sudden, a bush nearby rustled, instantly drawing Ariel's attention. She spun around, her eyes fixed on it with intense caution. The sky was now covered in dark clouds. A hand shoved the branches aside hard, as though someone were stepping out of the shadows. Meanwhile, Brian was also moving alone in a different direction. He suddenly stopped short, as if he had sensed killing intent right in front of him. A cold question rang out. "Who are you?" A gleaming sword lowered horizontally in open threat. Brian's eyes widened when he recognized that the one blocking his path was Hugo Pagati, and he immediately asked if he was Hugo Pagati. Hugo Pagati simply observed him in silence without answering, his face utterly cold and devoid of emotion. After a moment, Hugo Pagati finally parted his lips and asked whether Brian truly knew who he was. Brian's face immediately drained of color, turning deathly pale. His hand clenched so tightly that it trembled, and veins stood out all along his arm. Meanwhile, Hugo Pagati remarked that he had not expected someone to come looking for him of his own accord. He leisurely straightened up, then said with detached indifference that it did not really matter anyway. Brian stood frozen in place, not daring to make a single reckless move. His eyes flicked to the side, as if he had just seen something horrifying. All around Hugo Pagati lay countless corpses sprawled across the ground, with red blood spread everywhere like the aftermath of a massacre. Brian blurted out a question, asking if all of this had been orchestrated by Hugo Pagati alone. His voice turned ice cold as he demanded to know whether it was Hugo Pagati behind everything, from ordering the beast tamers to attack them earlier to slaughtering everyone here. Hugo Pagati remained rooted to the spot, coldly listening as Brian kept provoking him. Then he let out a crazed laugh. "None of that matters, because right now I can see more clearly than ever that you're desperate to kill me." The moment Brian heard that, he went rigid. Hugo Pagati curled his lips into a sinister smile. "Good, that only makes this better. Because right now, I'm craving the feeling of killing someone with my own hands too." Meanwhile, over on the other side, Kim Jian kept shouting Ariel's name at the top of his lungs. Kim Jian frantically searched for her. "Ariel, can you hear me? Say something." The main character was so shaken he could hardly believe it. She had vanished without a trace in the blink of an eye. Could she really be that absent-minded? He glanced back over his shoulder. On top of that, he was deeply worried about Brian going off alone like that. If Brian was truly facing those beast tamers or any other enemy by himself, Kim Jian knit his brows in frustration. The main character understood that if this kept going, the situation would spiral into a serious mess. Back on the other battlefield, that hand suddenly raised its blade high. Brian lifted his saber and faced him head-on, preparing to launch an attack. But that slash missed Hugo Pagati completely. Refusing to stop, Brian pressed forward with a relentless flurry of attacks. Hugo Pagati merely lowered his head and casually dodged every single strike. But the instant Brian exposed an opening, Hugo Pagati countered at once and slashed across his body. Blood dripped from the wound on his body, one drop at a time. Hugo Pagati gave a mocking chuckle. "I remember you now." Meanwhile, staggered backward, staring straight at him, Hugo Pagati said, "You're that guard dog who always stuck close to that old man's little girl, aren't you?" Hugo Pagatti raised a hand and pointed right at him with a faint sneer. I've always had an excellent memory. His gaze turned ice cold. I heard your young lady has been struck by a deadly poison. Hugo Pagatti slipped a hand inside his clothes. If that's really the case, then… He grinned grotesquely and pulled out a blue vial. Then I'm guessing you came here for this. Hugo Pagatti kept laughing. Isn't this a once-in-a-lifetime chance? You can save your lady and settle your revenge at the same time. Am I right? Seeing Brian freeze, he only grew more delighted and taunted him further. What's wrong? Don't tell me you're trembling from excitement. Hugo Pagatti set the vial on top of a rock. Don't rush. I wouldn't enjoy it either if your young lady died from such a cheap, pathetic poison. He continued threatening him. She survived that massacre all those years ago, only to end up dying pointlessly from a goblin's poisoned arrow. Brian could do nothing but stare at the vial. Hugo Pagatti closed his eyes and tilted his face toward the sky. If it ended like that, then honestly… Then a bizarre smile spread across his face. It wouldn't be the least bit entertaining. Hearing that, Brian could hold back no longer and charged. You bastard. Hugo Pagatti still stood there calmly. I'll admit your courage and loyalty are impressive. But Hugo Pagatti did not dodge at all. He only said coldly, it seems you still don't understand your own level of strength. Brian tightened his grip on his saber, murderous intent blazing in his eyes as he rushed straight in. But with only a light swing of his sword, Hugo Pagatti knocked the saber right out of Brian's hand. The blade slammed into the ground with tremendous force. Hugo Pagatti laughed coldly. Do you really delude yourself into thinking you can challenge me with a cheap toy like that? Brian's hand trembled violently, completely out of control. Blood streamed down from it and spread across the ground below. Brian thought to himself, I got too impatient and forgot for a moment. He understood all too well just how terrifyingly strong the man before him was. This was Hugo Pagatti. He was once the vice commander of the Ares Squad, one of the 12 Zodiac divisions, the most powerful Knight Legion in the Empire. He also carried an infamous title, the Perverse Battle Maniac. That name came from his insane obsession with one-on-one duels. His fixation ran so deep it was almost unbelievable. Even after the outcome had already been decided, he would still drag the enemy commander into a fight to the death before he was satisfied. The fact that a man like that was still alive today proved he had never once tasted defeat in any duel. Brian stared ahead, his eyes heavy with dread. Hugo Pagatti spoke with open ridicule. What's wrong? Where did all that blazing momentum from earlier disappear to? Brian lowered his head. Hugo Pagatti went on, let me tell you a little story to help you recover some of that fighting spirit. Hugo Pagatti's thin lips curled up again. This left eye scar is what Zanel Chalin gave me when he tried to save all of you. He let out a cold laugh. I'll admit his skill was extraordinary, truly worthy of being the heir of the kingdom's foremost knightly house. Honestly, it was the finest duel I've ever had. Hugo Pagatti narrowed his eyes. You should have been there to watch the light fade from his eyes as my sword pierced his heart. A sight that magnificent was wasted on me alone. Hugo Pagatti declared, so I came up with a wonderful idea. After I kill you here, Brian froze. I'll personally go down to that village and tell your young lady everything. Both of them looked at the blue vial, and after I hand her the antidote, I'll issue my challenge. Hugo Pagatti's cruelty was written all over his face. Then I'll watch that little girl charge at me in absolute fury. After that, I'll carve her up slowly like an artist painstakingly sculpting a masterpiece. I'll make her taste the slowest pain possible. So what do you think? Isn't that plan irresistible? Brian answered in a firm voice. Never. Then he raised his saber. He roared, that kind of madness will never happen, because the one who dies here will be you. The instant he finished speaking, Brian exploded forward with arrow-like speed. He moved terrifyingly fast, his eyes blazing bright and overflowing with killing intent. Brian charged straight at Hugo Pagatti without the slightest hesitation. He swung his saber and brought it crashing down right in front of him. But Hugo Pagatti lightly stepped aside as if it took no effort at all. Immediately after that, he launched a horizontal slash straight at Brian's waist. Blood burst from Brian's side and sprayed everywhere. Brian's feet skidded across the ground from the force left behind by the blow. Even so, he refused to yield and instantly threw a punch back at Hugo Pagatti. Once again, Hugo Pagatti swung his sword and slashed across Brian's leg. The deep cut sent even more blood pouring out. Brian squeezed his eyes tight, his gaze packed with fury. Then he twisted his body and sprang backward hard to open up some distance. Brian panted in heavy breaths. Seeing Hugo Pagatti's relaxed posture only made him angrier. What the hell are you even doing? Hugo Pagatti calmly replied, you're asking what I'm doing. Hugo Pagatti gave a cold laugh. Isn't it already painfully obvious? He mocked him casually. I'm only making sure this toy doesn't break too soon. Brian roared in fury. You bastard! Hugo Pagatti cut him off. Don't worry so much. I'm starting to get bored of this game anyway. The moment he finished speaking, he shifted backward. But that was only a feint. Hugo Pagatti had already suddenly gathered momentum and shot forward. Brian froze for an instant, his eyes flying wide in shock. A terrifying vertical slash tore straight through his body. Blood erupted from Brian's arms, legs, and every part of his body. Brian went numb with shock. That thing could actually extend that far? Elsewhere, an incredibly adorable little rabbit was sitting perfectly still. Ariel silently observed it, then blurted out, "What the hell is going on here?" She wondered what kind of creature in this other world could possibly leave footprints this gigantic. Ariel stared at the trail of stomped prints ahead of her, because they led straight toward the supermarket. She lowered her head and thought it over. Could these be monsters controlled by those beast tamers too? Ariel pushed herself up with her staff and tried to calm down, telling herself the estate still had soldiers and hunters, so things probably had not reached the worst-case scenario yet. She dragged her tired feet forward, determined to safely regroup with the rest of the team as quickly as possible. But right then an unexpected sound rang out from behind her. Ariel spun around at once. She figured she should deal with this monster first, then keep searching for the others. Since she was already off course, catching up with them would be difficult anyway. On the other side, a hand had collapsed to the ground, while blood kept pouring out without stop. Hugo Pagatti spoke in a mocking tone, saying he had to admit the other man's stubbornness was impressive. A cold smirk curled on his lips. In his eyes, this was not bravery at all, just pointless desperation. Hugo Pagatti continued his merciless ridicule. Since the prey before him was no longer entertaining, he would grant him a clean and tidy death. Brian clenched his teeth hard because he had been far too reckless. He had charged in without any plan, even though he knew the gap in power between himself and that bastard was hopelessly vast. Rage had clouded his judgment and driven him to do what he would normally never choose. Deep down, he had understood that for a long time already. A man like him had never had even the slightest chance against that piece of trash. That truth drove him mad, even more violently than the enemy before him. He hated his own weakness, and the fact that he could not protect a single thing only pushed him deeper into despair. Hugo Pagatti spoke again. With a sinister grin, he raised his sword high and coldly said farewell, before bringing it down to end everything. But at that exact moment, a loud blast suddenly rang out. A blood-smeared stone rolled across the ground. Hugo Pagatti instantly whipped his head around to look behind him. Brian also forced his eyes open and looked to the side. Kim Jian had arrived at the perfect moment and pulled him back from the brink of death. Hugo grabbed his bleeding face. Hugo Pagatti roared and demanded to know who the hell had just interfered. He answered calmly that he wanted to ask the exact same question in return. Kim stared him with unwavering resolve and coldly asked what he was and why he was trying to kill Brian on purpose. Brian immediately shouted for Kim Jian to get out of there now, but the moment he finished speaking, Hugo Pagatti lifted his leg high. He kicked Brian square in the body, sending him flying violently backward. Kim Jian cried out Brian's name in shock. Hugo Pagatti bellowed in fury, as if he could not believe that fool had dared to stand in his way. Grinding his teeth, he shouted that Kim Jian was interfering in a sacred duel. Kim Jian frowned in annoyance and shot back, asking what kind of nonsense he was babbling about. His eyes widened, every nerve in his body on the highest alert. A heartbeat later, Hugo Pagatti unleashed another vicious slash, but Kim Jian still managed to evade it, bending his upper body backward by a hair's breadth. Hugo froze for a split second, not expecting him to dodge that strike. Kim Jian gritted his teeth, still unable to understand what exactly had just happened. He narrowly slipped past another killing slash and shouted, demanding to know what trick Hugo was using. Suddenly, a dazzling flash of light burst out. Hugo Pagatti immediately sprang backward. A flicker of doubt crossed his face as he wondered if that had been magic. Hugo Pagatti frowned deeply. Then he dismissed the idea, because if he called it magic, that still would not be entirely accurate. His hand trembled faintly. This power probably was not a system skill or mana at all, but sheer physical ability pushed to an abnormal extreme. Kim Jian spoke up, saying that from the very first sword strike, it had been obvious the other man was trying to kill him. His eyes burned with determination as he declared that Hugo had never intended to toy with him in the first place. Hugo Pagatti sneered and judged him to be a bizarre weapon paired with equally bizarre power. He glanced at Brian and remarked that Kim Jian seemed to have made friends with someone pretty interesting. Hugo Pagatti rubbed his neck, as if his boredom had finally just been swept away. Then a crafty, delighted smile spread across his face. He wanted to see where his opponent's limits truly lay. The instant he finished speaking, Hugo Pagatti swung his sword and lunged forward. He brought down a direct strike, but Kim Jian still dodged it in an instant. Hugo Pagatti did not hesitate in the slightest. Tightening his grip on the hilt, he followed with another slash. Kim Jian immediately bent backward again, letting the blade skim past him. That razor-sharp sword kept pressing forward without pause, forcing him into defense with one relentless attack after another. Even so, Kim Jian used every bit of his skill to surge back in and counterattack. That left Hugo Pagatti genuinely stunned, making him wonder where this monster had come from. He stared fixedly at Kim Jian and admitted that level of reaction speed was truly terrifying. Even so, Hugo Pagatti kept his composure and thrust his sword straight ahead, but at that exact instant his eyes flew wide open as he realized something was wrong. Hugo Pagatti hurriedly brought his sword across to block Kim Jian's blow, and in that moment he understood the issue was not merely fast reflexes. Kim Jian blasted his strike aside with overwhelming force, sending Hugo Pagatti's entire body reeling backward. His whole body skidded across the ground, leaving deep footprints carved into the earth behind him. Hugo Pageti knit his brows tightly, finally realizing where the real threat to him lay. He stared hard at Kim Jian and understood that the true danger was the boy's explosively monstrous physical strength. Hugo Pageti quickly concluded that if he took even one full hit, he would almost certainly die on the spot. The corner of his mouth slowly curled to a cold, eerie smile. Hugo Pageti laughed darkly and said it had been a long time since he had been in a battle where his life was this clearly under threat. Seeing that reaction, even Kim Jian could not help shivering. He quickly realized that the killing intent around Hugo had changed completely. His survival instincts made him leap sharply backward at once. Hugo Pageti twisted his body, shifted his stance, and drove force through every part of himself. His teeth ground together, and his eyes gleamed with the manic grin of someone on the verge of madness. Like a true lunatic, Hugo Pageti burst into laughter, told his opponent not to disappoint him, then slashed horizontally at Kim Jian. The force behind that slash exploded with terrifying power, as if it wanted to tear the air itself apart. Blood instantly burst from Kim Jian's arms and legs under the impact of that attack. That was dynamic visual acuity, the ability to track fast-moving objects with extreme precision. For a baseball player especially, this was practically a core skill. Kim Jian had built his reputation on his extraordinary ability to read a ball's trajectory. The time Kim Jian needed to judge whether a pitch was a strike or a ball was only around 0.15 seconds. And that was exactly why he could not make sense of what was happening, because in his eyes that sword path looked far too warped and unnatural to be real. Hugo Pageti let out a cold sneer. Impressive. In a split-second opening like that, he still managed to dodge my lightning-fast punch. The vicious glint in his eyes pushed the whole situation far beyond what anyone had expected at the start. Kim Jian clutched the wound in his abdomen. The pain made him falter for an instant. He frowned. Damn it. If this fight drags on any longer, things will only get worse for him. Kim Jian's expression darkened. From technique to experience, this opponent was a monster on every level. Against someone like him, did he really still have any chance to win? Heavy drops of blood fell one by one, thudding against the ground. Kim Jian sat there in silence. Holding his head in both hands, he let out a helpless sigh. He'd been struck out yet again. A voice rang out. Don't beat yourself up so much, Kim Jian. When he looked up, he saw the man standing in front of him. His coach. The coach reassured him. It's not that you played badly. Your opponent is just abnormal. He's only a middle schooler, yet he can already throw left-handed at over 130 kilometers per hour. Kim Jian admitted gloomily, to be honest, I can't see any way to hit that. The ball's too fast, and I'm still not used to facing a left-handed pitcher. The corners of the coach's mouth lifted into a faint smile. He called Kim Jian over. Hey Kim Jian, there's no pitcher alive who doesn't give something away. The coach raised the ball. Watch for the habits your opponent reveals right before he throws. He instructed him gently. From his setup to the area he usually aims for, all of it follows a pattern. Kim Jian listened with full concentration. If he observed carefully enough, sooner or later he would spot the irregularity. That old lesson still echoed in his mind. In an ordinary armed fight, whichever hand a person favors determines which foot they put forward. His gaze locked tightly onto Hugo Pageti. That meant the right hand and right foot should be forward. But this man had taken a left-leading stance instead. A left hand, left foot lead was normally used by a right-handed fighter. With that long weapon controlling all the space in front of him, Kim Jian couldn't charge into close combat head-on. The only weakness he could exploit was the ruined left eye. His depth perception should have been affected, but it seemed the man had compensated through training and instinct. Even so, with that side-turned stance and the blindness in his left eye, one thing was almost certain. He had a massive blind spot. All right, that first stone had caught him off guard, and it was probably because of that exact reason. If he could make use of that blind angle and land one precise strike, then his chance of victory still wasn't gone. Hugo Pageti launched another savage slash. His eyes burned with frustration every time Kim Jian dodged. Kim Jian ground his teeth hard. Kim Jian charged straight at Hugo Pageti without a hint of hesitation, but his opponent was no amateur either. He instantly twisted aside to evade. Kim Jian's eyes widened. He had to strike directly into the man's blind spot. Hugo Pageti quickly regained his composure. He gave him no chance to breathe and immediately swung his sword in a horizontal slash at his torso, but Kim Jian stubbornly ducked low to avoid it. As long as he understood the way the man gripped his weapon, the direction of the attack would be exposed. But Hugo Pageti was still one step faster. He drove a brutally powerful kick straight at his opponent's head. Kim Jian was kicked backward. Blood sprayed from his mouth into the air. He crashed onto his back. Hugo mocked him, saying, "Looks like your strength is finally running dry." The staff fell to the ground with a harsh metallic clatter. Hugo Pageti sneered. "I'll admit it, your physical endurance really is impressive." Kim Jian forced himself upright and wiped the corner of his mouth. Hearing that taunt, he answered coldly, "That's all you've got." Hugo Pageti continued to look down on him. Just a back alley brawler, no technique, no discipline. What he didn't realize was that Kim Jian had already secretly grabbed a stone from beneath him. With killing intent surging violently, Hugo Pagetti rushed in to attack. This ends here. His fierce slash was once again avoided by the narrowest margin. Right after that, Kim Ji-an spun and counterattacked. His teeth were clenched tight with determination. His hand gripped the object he was holding with crushing force. Then he swung hard and hurled it straight at Hugo Pagetti. But the man's reflexes were fast too. He immediately dodged diagonally to the side. Hugo Pagetti roared in contempt. Nothing but cheap tricks. But at that exact moment the stone still skimmed past, aimed straight at Hugo Pagetti's eye. Seizing that precious instant, Kim Ji-an immediately lunged forward with a surprise attack. He faltered as the stone disrupted his vision. My eye! By the time he could see clearly again, his opponent was already charging right in front of him with overwhelming killing intent. Hugo Pagetti's eyes flew wide open, filled with both terror and ferocity. Blood burst through the air. Kim Ji-an was drenched red across half his body as well. The scarred side of Hugo Pagetti's face now looked more eerie and terrifying than ever. Kim Ji-an wore a grim expression, hiding an unreadable will of iron. He stared at Hugo Pagetti without blinking. Now the weapons of both men were locked against each other. But Hugo Pagetti's blade had also pierced straight through Kim Ji-an's chest. A flash of panic crossed Hugo Pagetti's face. His brows immediately drew tight. The sword remained buried deep, pinned fast in front of that chest. Blood slowly spilled from Kim Ji-an's mouth. Hugo Pagetti showed a sinister smile. Not bad. At the very least, I acknowledge your effort. Suddenly a hand clamped down tightly around the sword. He still wore a smile on his lips. This ends right here. Kim Ji-an immediately called out to Brian, and at that very moment Brian appeared behind Hugo, raising his knife high with murderous intent blazing in his eyes, ready to bring it down.